Welcome to Lumos. Before we begin, I'd love if you could gently tap that like button. And if you enjoy these calm, wandering science stories, consider subscribing. It helps more curious, sleepy souls find their way here. I always love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're listening and what time your night has become. I find so much joy in those sleepy check-ins. The story of ancient Egypt begins not with pyramids, not with kings, not even with gods, but with a river, the Nile. Flowing over 4,000 miles through the heart of Africa, the Nile was no ordinary river. It was life itself. To the east and west stretched endless desert, vast oceans of sand and stone, where survival was nearly impossible. Yet here, along the banks of the Nile, life bloomed. Grasses bent with the wind, reeds swayed by the water, and fertile black soil carried the promise of harvests. Each year, like clockwork, the Nile would flood. It wasn't seen as disaster, it was a gift. The waters carried silt from distant mountains, spreading it across the land and turning Egypt into one of the most fertile places in the ancient world. Wheat, barley, flax, and papyrus grew in abundance. Without this yearly rhythm, there would be no Egypt. Welcome to Lumos. Before we begin, I'd love if you could gently tap that like button. And if you enjoy these calm, wandering science stories, the ancient people knew this. They understood that their very existence depended on the balance between the river and the desert, between life and death. They even had names for it: Kemet, the black land for the fertile soil, and Deshret, the red land for the burning desert beyond. This balance between black and red, between life and chaos, would echo through their myths, their temples, and their beliefs for thousands of years. Around 5000 BCE, small farming villages appeared along the Nile. Families built simple homes out of mud brick, tended their crops, and domesticated animals. They learned to make pottery, to weave linen, and to craft tools of copper. But these were not just farmers, they were observers of nature. They watched the stars, they followed the flood cycles, they learned to measure time, and they built the foundations of what would become one of the most enduring civilizations in history. Over centuries, these small communities grew larger. Rival leaders rose, some claiming power over several villages. Eventually, Egypt was divided into two great regions: Upper Egypt in the south and Lower Egypt in the north, near the Nile Delta. For centuries, these two lands existed side by side, trading, competing, and sometimes warring. Then, around 3100 BCE, legend tells of a king named Narmer, also known as Menes. He rose from Upper Egypt, marched north, and united the two lands under one crown. This was the beginning of something entirely new, a single kingdom stretching from the delta in the north to the first cataract in the south. Narmer wore the double crown, symbolizing unity: white for Upper Egypt, red for Lower Egypt. From this moment, Egypt became more than just a river valley. It became a nation, ruled by a king who was not just a man, but a god on earth. The Egyptians believed their king, the pharaoh, was the earthly embodiment of Horus, the falcon god, and upon death, he would transform into Osiris, lord of the afterlife. The pharaoh was not merely a political ruler. He was the center of the universe, responsible for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic principle of truth, order, and balance. If the Nile flooded too little, famine struck. If enemies invaded, chaos threatened. These disasters were not seen as natural accidents. They were signs that Ma'at had been broken, and it was the pharaoh's sacred duty to restore it. This belief in divine kingship would drive the Egyptians to build temples, monuments, and tombs unlike anything the world had ever seen. To the Egyptians, death was not an ending, but a journey. They believed that the soul, or Ka, continued after death. But for the Ka to live on, the body had to remain intact. This single belief gave birth to one of the most iconic practices in human history, mummification. The earliest burials were simple, shallow graves in the desert sand. Ironically, it was the hot, dry climate that preserved the bodies naturally. Over time, Egyptians realized preservation mattered. They began wrapping the dead, placing them in coffins, and surrounding them with goods, food, tools, ornaments, everything a soul might need in the afterlife. This growing obsession with death and eternity would shape the architecture of Egypt, leading eventually to the construction of the first pyramids. By 2700 BCE, kings were no longer content with simple tombs. They wanted monuments that would last forever, structures that would connect earth to heaven, and tombs so magnificent that even the gods would take notice. This ambition gave rise to Egypt's first monumental stone structure, the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, built for Pharaoh Djoser by his brilliant architect Imhotep. The first pyramid, Djoser's stairway to the heavens. When we think of pyramids, our minds leap instantly to Giza, to the soaring limestone mountains that pierce the desert sky. But before those marvels could ever rise, before Egypt had perfected the art of pyramid building, there was one man, Pharaoh Djoser, who dared to dream beyond tradition, and one man, his architect Imhotep, who dared to make that dream real. Djoser, a ruler of Egypt's third dynasty around 2670 BCE, inherited a kingdom that was already powerful and centralized, but he wanted to leave behind something greater than prosperity or conquest. He wanted a tomb that would not only house his body for eternity, but also proclaim to all who saw it that he was more than a king. He was a god on earth, destined to live forever in the afterlife. Until then, pharaohs had been buried in mastabas, flat-roofed mud brick tombs shaped like trapezoids, practical and modest, their bodies protected beneath sand and stone. But to Djoser, this was not enough. He desired something eternal, something that would withstand the endless winds of the desert and the passage of millennia. And for this monumental task, he turned to his vizier and high priest, Imhotep, a man of extraordinary vision, scientist, healer, priest, architect, and scribe. A man so far ahead of his time that later generations would worship him as a god of wisdom and medicine. Imhotep's idea was daring. Instead of a single mastaba, why not build a series of them, each one smaller than the last, stacked one upon another like a giant staircase to the heavens? And instead of perishable mud brick, why not use limestone, cut from quarries and shaped by human hands into blocks that would last forever? This idea was revolutionary, for stone had been used sparingly before, in small shrines or temples, but never on such a colossal scale. And so, under the scorching Egyptian sun, armies of laborers, craftsmen, and engineers began to cut and drag massive limestone blocks across the desert, hauling them into place with ropes, sledges, and sheer determination, building not just a tomb, but a monument unlike anything the world had ever seen. The result was the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, a structure that rose over 200 feet into the sky, the tallest building of its time, towering above the desert like a man-made mountain, a staircase of 6 giant steps that symbolized the pharaoh's ascension into the heavens. For the Egyptians, this was no mere architectural feat, it was a spiritual revolution, for the pyramid itself became a pathway for the king's soul, the Ka, to rise toward the gods. Surrounding this colossal tomb was a vast funerary complex, nearly 37 acres in size, enclosed by a limestone wall with 14 false doors. Portals through which Djoser's spirit could pass between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Within the complex stood chapels, shrines, courtyards for rituals, and ceremonial halls, each designed to ensure that Djoser's afterlife would mirror the grandeur of his earthly reign. Beneath the pyramid stretched a labyrinth of tunnels, corridors, and chambers. Some estimates suggest nearly 6 kilometers of passageways, filled with thousands of stone vessels, food offerings, and symbolic treasures, meant to serve the pharaoh for eternity, a literal underground palace for the afterlife. Among these tunnels was a central burial chamber made of granite. By raising this eternal staircase of stone, Djoser and Imhotep declared that Egypt itself was in alignment with the gods, that chaos had been subdued, and that the pharaoh's rule was eternal. The pyramid was both a tomb and a temple, both an engineering achievement and a theological statement. Proof that man, guided by divine order, could create something that reached toward immortality. And in this, Djoser achieved exactly what he had hoped for. More than 4,000 years later, his pyramid still stands, weathered yet proud, the oldest stone colossus on Earth, the first of its kind and the prototype for all that would follow. Imhotep's brilliance was so admired that centuries later he was remembered not as a man but as a god. Worshipped in temples, his name whispered in prayers for healing and wisdom, his legacy etched into eternity alongside the stones he had placed at Saqqara. And yet, even as Djoser's pyramid rose triumphant, it was only the beginning of an age of experimentation, for not every king who followed would succeed in building monuments of such grandeur. The ambition to build ever larger, ever more perfect pyramids would drive Egypt's architects and laborers into daring trials, with some pyramids collapsing under their own weight, others abandoned mid-construction, and still others reshaped in strange ways as mistakes revealed themselves in stone. The path from the Step Pyramid to the Great Pyramid of Giza was not a straight line, but a story of innovation, failure, correction, and triumph. A story that reveals not just the determination of the kings, but the genius and sometimes the hubris of the men who served them. And so, as the sun set over Djoser's pyramid and the desert winds whispered through the stone courtyards of Saqqara, a new age began, the age of the pyramids, when kings would dedicate their lives to constructing monuments so vast that they would command the horizon, define the skyline, and etch themselves into the very soul of Egypt. Monuments that would outlast kingdoms, empires, and civilizations themselves. And in the next chapter of this journey, we will step into that age of bold experimentation, where one pharaoh's ambition to surpass Djoser would lead to both failure and brilliance, and where stone itself would reveal its secrets in the making of the Bent Pyramid. The Age of Experiments, Sneferu and the Bent Pyramid. After the towering step pyramid of Djoser had risen proudly at Saqqara, its shadow stretching over the desert like the mark of a god, Egypt entered a new chapter, one of bold ambition and restless innovation. For kings now sought not just to be remembered, but to surpass one another in the grandeur of their eternal tombs. And it was here, in the dawn of the 4th dynasty, that a pharaoh named Sneferu would step into history as the greatest builder of them all. A ruler whose insatiable desire for perfection drove his architects and laborers to attempt feats never before imagined. Whose reign was not marked by a single pyramid, but by 3 colossal monuments, each one a lesson in the journey from experimentation to mastery. Sneferu inherited a stable, prosperous Egypt, rich with resources and manpower. And unlike many rulers content with the traditions of their ancestors, he possessed a restless vision, a determination to leave behind not only wealth or power, but a monument that would declare to all time that he was chosen by the gods, a man who could tame stone itself. His first attempt at fulfilling this vision began at Meidum, where he ordered a massive step pyramid, intended to evolve beyond Djoser's design by smoothing the steps into clean, angled sides that would rise like the rays of the sun toward heaven. But as generations of workers toiled to transform its shape, laying outer layers of stone to cover the core, the structure proved unstable, and in antiquity, much of it collapsed, leaving behind a strange ruin, a solitary tower of stone surrounded by a mountain of rubble. known today as the collapsed pyramid. A haunting reminder of ambition that fell short, a warning carved into the desert itself that greatness would not be achieved easily. Yet Sneferu was undeterred, for failure did not frighten him, it fueled him. And so he turned his gaze to a new site at Dashur, where his architects would attempt once more to capture the perfect form of eternity. And here began the story of the most unusual of all pyramids, the bent pyramid. At Dashur, the vision was clear, a pyramid of smooth, gleaming sides, rising at a sharp angle of 54 degrees, a monument that would pierce the heavens and stand as the truest symbol of divine kingship. But as the structure climbed higher, problems began to emerge. Cracks spidered through the internal chambers, pressure bore down on the foundations, and whispers of collapse filled the air. It became clear that if the pyramid continued at its steep angle, the entire structure might tumble down like the ruins of Medum. And so, in a moment of both desperation and brilliance, the builders made a bold decision. Midway through construction, they changed the angle, reducing it to 43 degrees, giving the pyramid its distinctive, almost awkward profile, wide and steep at the base, shallow and sloping at the top, a hybrid form that has baffled and fascinated historians ever since. To the Egyptians, however, the bent pyramid was not a failure, but a victory, for it was completed, it stood tall, and, most importantly, it became the first pyramid ever finished with smooth, polished casing stones, many of which still gleam in the desert sun over 4,000 years later, showing us what all pyramids must once have looked like when they shone brilliantly in the light, dazzling travelers from miles away, symbols of divine perfection glowing against the endless sand. And though its shape may have been born from engineering necessity, the bent pyramid carried profound symbolism. Its bend perhaps interpreted as the pharaoh bowing before the gods, a visible reminder that even kings must acknowledge the forces greater than themselves, that even in striving for eternity, man must respect the balance between ambition and order. But Sneferu was not a man who settled for compromise. He was not satisfied with the imperfect angles of the bent pyramid. And so, with unshaken determination, he ordered yet another colossal monument at Dashur, one that would embody the lessons learned from both Medum and the bent pyramid. This new creation, known today as the Red Pyramid, rose at a shallower, carefully calculated angle of 43 degrees from its base to its peak, ensuring stability without sacrificing grandeur. And when completed, it became the first true smooth-sided pyramid in history, soaring nearly 345 feet into the desert sky, its reddish limestone earning it its modern name, its shape finally achieving the perfect triangular form that would define Egyptian architecture for centuries. Within its chambers, hidden deep inside, Sneferu prepared for his eternal journey, his body placed in a tomb that was both palace and gateway, a statement of power carved into stone, a physical embodiment of his role as the divine bridge between earth and the heavens. Through these three pyramids, Medum, the Bent, and the Red, Sneferu's reign transformed not just the skyline of Egypt, but the very imagination of his people, teaching them that perfection was not born in a single stroke, but through persistence, through error and correction, through boldness and resilience. And it is this legacy that ensured his name would echo in history, not merely as a king, but as a visionary builder, the father of the Pyramid Age. What Sneferu gave to Egypt was more than stone piled into geometric shapes. He gave them proof that human hands, guided by divine purpose, could create eternity itself. His bent pyramid stands as a living reminder of the struggle between ambition and reality, a monument that whispers of failure turned to triumph, while his Red Pyramid became the direct precursor to the most famous pyramid of all, the Great Pyramid at Giza, built by his son Khufu, who would take Sneferu's experiments and elevate them to their ultimate perfection. Yet, in truth, Sneferu's story is not only about architecture, but about humanity. About a people so deeply devoted to the belief in life after death that they mobilized entire armies of workers. Thousands upon thousands of men and women, farmers, craftsmen, and engineers who toiled under the desert sun, not as slaves in chains as often imagined, but as loyal subjects fulfilling what they saw as a sacred duty, carving their devotion into stone, building not just for their king, but for Ma'at itself, the principle of order that held the cosmos together. And so, when we look upon Sneferu's pyramids today, we do not merely see ruins or relics. We see the very heartbeat of a civilization reaching beyond mortality, experimenting, failing, rising again. Each stone a story, each angle a lesson, each monument a promise to the gods that Egypt would endure forever. And it is from this crucible of ambition and perseverance that the greatest wonder of the ancient world would be born, the Great Pyramid of Giza, Khufu's masterpiece, the zenith of pyramid building, and the next great chapter in the secrets of ancient Egypt. Khufu and the Great Pyramid, the monument of eternity. If Sneferu was the father of pyramids, then his son Khufu, known to the Greeks as Cheops, was their conqueror, the king who took his father's experiments and transformed them into perfection, raising a monument so vast, so precise, and so enduring that it would become the only surviving wonder of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Giza, a structure that for nearly 4,000 years remained the tallest building on Earth, dwarfing every temple, palace, and tower that came after it, a mountain of stone built not by nature but by human hands. Khufu ascended the throne around 2589 BCE, inheriting not only the throne of Egypt, but the lessons carved into the bent pyramid and the red pyramid of his father. And from the beginning, his ambition was clear. He would not settle for greatness. He would not be content with what had been done before. He would build something so monumental that his name would live for eternity, something that would declare his divine power to gods and men alike. And so, on the plateau of Giza, overlooking the fertile valley of the Nile and the endless horizon of the desert, construction began on the most audacious project humanity had ever attempted. The vision was staggering. A pyramid rising to a height of nearly 480 feet, its base covering 13 acres, its sides sloping at the perfect angle of 51 degrees, a geometric form aligned with the cardinal points of the compass so precisely that even today, with lasers and satellites, the accuracy still stuns engineers. A structure composed of more than 2 million blocks of limestone, each weighing on average 2.5 tons, some as heavy as 70, quarried, transported, and set into place without iron tools, without wheels, without modern cranes, only with copper chisels, wooden sledges, ropes of flax, and the strength of human determination. And yet, despite the enormity of the task, Khufu's vision did not falter. For he believed that as pharaoh, he was the living embodiment of Horus, the divine falcon, and upon his death, he would become Osiris, ruler of the afterlife. And to secure that transition, his tomb must be no less than a gateway between heaven and earth, a ladder to eternity. The logistics of such a project were as breathtaking as the monument itself. Tens of thousands of workers, perhaps more, were gathered from across Egypt. Not slaves in chains, as later myths would suggest, but farmers, craftsmen, and laborers who offered their time during the Nile's flood season when fields lay underwater and farming paused, forming rotating crews who worked in shifts, supported by an entire infrastructure of bakeries, breweries, butcheries, and workshops at Giza, a city of workers that thrived in the shadow of the growing pyramid. These men lived in barracks, ate bread and beer, received medical care for injuries, and participated in a colossal effort that bound the entire nation together. For to build the king's pyramid was not mere labor, it was an act of devotion, a sacred duty, ensuring not only the pharaoh's eternity, but the cosmic balance of Ma'at itself. And in return, the workers were remembered in stone graffiti left inside the pyramid. The drunkards of Menkaure, the friends of Khufu, proud signatures of crews who took ownership of their work, immortalizing themselves alongside the monument of their king. The methods they used remain debated: ramps spiraling around the structure, straight ramps of mud brick and rubble stretching from the plateau, or ingenious lever systems. But however they did it, stone by stone, year after year, the pyramid rose. Each block placed with care, each angle checked with string and plumb, each measurement tied to the stars themselves, until the great mountain of limestone stood complete. Its sides, once clad in smooth white casing stones, polished to a brilliance that reflected the sun so fiercely it must have appeared as a jewel on the desert's horizon, a literal horizon of Khufu, as the ancient Egyptians named it. Inside the pyramid lay a world of mystery and mastery, a descending passage leading into the bedrock, chambers unfinished and abandoned, and above them the grand galleries and hidden rooms that still confound archaeologists today. The most famous is the King's Chamber, built not of limestone but of massive granite blocks hauled from Aswan over 500 miles away, weighing up to 80 tons each, stacked with such precision that the chamber remains intact to this day, its ceiling supported by a series of relieving chambers designed to redirect the crushing weight of the stone above, a feat of engineering so advanced that it would not be matched again for millennia. Within this chamber once lay Khufu's sarcophagus, a massive granite box too large to fit through the corridors, meaning it must have been placed during construction and built around, ensuring it could never be removed, the eternal prison of the king's body. But as with so many tombs, looters in antiquity likely robbed Khufu's burial long ago, leaving behind only the empty granite sarcophagus we see today. Yet even without treasures, the chamber itself radiates a sense of awe, the silent heart of the greatest monument ever built. For the Egyptians, the pyramid was more than stone, more than a tomb. It was a cosmic machine, a bridge between the mortal world and the eternal, its shape reflecting the rays of the sun god Ra, its alignment with the stars symbolizing the pharaoh's ascent into the heavens, its massive bulk embodying the permanence of Ma'at against the chaos of time and death. It was believed that through rituals performed in the pyramid complex, Khufu's Ka would travel along the celestial pathways, joining the gods and reigning forever in the field of reeds, the paradise of the afterlife. Surrounding the Great Pyramid were smaller pyramids for queens, mastabas for nobles, temples for rituals, and even great pits in which full-sized boats were buried. Solar barks meant to carry the pharaoh across the skies with the sun god himself. Vessels that have been excavated and reconstructed in modern times, revealing timbers and craftsmanship preserved for over 4 millennia. All of this formed not just a tomb, but a city of eternity, a place where the divine and the earthly merged, where the living served the dead, and where stone proclaimed truths that no voice could silence. When the Great Pyramid stood completed, gleaming in the desert sun, capped with a golden pyramidion that shone like fire at dawn, it must have seemed to the people of Egypt that Khufu had achieved immortality, that his horizon truly stretched beyond death. And indeed, more than 4,500 years later, the pyramid still dominates the plateau of Giza, weathered yet unconquered, its bulk a challenge to time itself. For centuries, it inspired awe and wonder, drawing travelers like Herodotus, who wrote of its grandeur in the 5th century BCE, and later Greek and Roman visitors who could scarcely believe it was made by human hands. In the Middle Ages, it was counted as one of the 7 wonders of the world. And though 6 others fell to ruin or fire, Khufu's pyramid alone endures, a testament to the ambition of one man and the devotion of a nation. But behind the glory lay controversy too, for ancient sources tell of Khufu as a harsh ruler, a tyrant who compelled his people into endless labor, while others argue he was simply a king whose vision demanded sacrifices. And so the debate remains. Was Khufu a despot who drained his people's lives into stone? Or was he a leader who united Egypt in a shared pursuit of eternity? Perhaps both truths coexist, bound together as inseparably as the blocks of limestone in his pyramid. For history rarely divides cleanly into praise or blame, especially when monuments this immense still stand to silence our judgments. And so, the Great Pyramid remains, not merely a tomb, but a question, not merely a monument, but a mirror of human ambition, a reminder that civilizations rise not only on conquest or wealth, but on vision. And Khufu's vision was nothing less than eternity itself. His pyramid was the zenith of the Old Kingdom, the crown jewel of Egyptian architecture, a beacon to gods and men. And though time would weather its casing stones, strip its treasures, and bury its builders in dust, the monument itself stands, vast and immovable, defying centuries, whispering across millennia. Here lies a king who sought immortality, and in stone he found it. Khafre, the guardian of stone and the great Sphinx. When Khufu died and the mantle of kingship passed down, the horizon of Giza did not rest, for his son Khafre, called Khephren by the Greeks, stepped forward with ambition equal to his father's, determined that the glory of his reign would not be overshadowed, but rather magnified. And so he raised his own pyramid on the Giza Plateau, slightly smaller in height than his father's, but built on higher ground, giving the illusion that it towered just as high, a clever gesture of architectural rivalry that spoke volumes about the competition even within royal bloodlines. Khafre's pyramid, rising to about 471 feet, preserved much of its original casing at the very top, allowing modern visitors to glimpse what the entire pyramid field once looked like when polished limestone shimmered under the blazing Egyptian sun, dazzling travelers from miles away, as if the gods themselves had planted mountains of light upon the desert's edge. But Khafre's contribution to eternity went beyond his pyramid, for he also commissioned one of the most enigmatic and iconic monuments in human history, the Great Sphinx of Giza. A colossal guardian carved directly from the limestone bedrock, half lion, half man, crouched eternally at the foot of the plateau, staring eastward into the rising sun. A silent sentinel whose face, many believe, bears the likeness of Khafre himself, merging human rulership with divine power. Stretching 240 feet in length and standing 66 feet high, the Sphinx is the largest monolithic statue of the ancient world, its paws once extending before it like the arms of a god embracing the earth, its body painted in vivid colors now lost to time, its face adorned with a ceremonial beard and a uraeus, the royal serpent symbol of kingship, all testifying that this was no mere statue, but a cosmic guardian, a physical embodiment of the pharaoh's eternal vigilance, protecting the necropolis of Giza and ensuring that no chaos would disturb the order of Ma'at which the pyramids symbolized. The construction of the Sphinx remains as much a mystery as its purpose, for while Khafre is most commonly credited, some argue it may be older still, a relic of forgotten kings before Khufu, repurposed in Khafre's time, its weathered body whispering of reigns and climates long past, fueling debates among archaeologists, geologists, and dreamers alike. Yet whatever its origin, by the time of Khafre, it had been woven into his complex as if it were always meant to stand guard. Aligned with his valley temple, a massive limestone structure where priests performed purification rituals for the king's body before it journeyed through the causeway up to the mortuary temple and finally into the pyramid itself, a sacred choreography of death and rebirth, where Khafre's corpse was not merely buried but transformed, ritually reawakened to join the gods. The temple's massive granite blocks, polished to mirror-like smoothness, still stand today as if defying time, their joints so tight one cannot slip a blade between them, a testament to the extraordinary precision of Egyptian builders. Together, pyramid, causeway, valley temple, and sphinx formed a sacred landscape, an orchestrated masterpiece of architecture and symbolism, binding earth to heaven, life to God. The Sphinx itself became a riddle for the ages, its inscrutable face inspiring reverence and fear. In later centuries, pharaohs of the New Kingdom, like Thutmose IV, came to worship at its paws, leaving behind the dream stele, a granite slab placed between its forelegs, recounting how, while resting in the shadow of the buried Sphinx, the young prince dreamt that the gods spoke to him, promising kingship if he would clear away the sands that choked its body. A tale that reveals not only the religious power attributed to the statue, but also how quickly time and desert sought to reclaim it. For even by 1400 BCE, the Sphinx was already ancient, already half swallowed by drifting dunes, already a relic of a mysterious golden age. And so Khafre's legacy was twofold: the continuation of the pyramid-building tradition at Giza, securing his name alongside his father's, and the creation of the world's most iconic guardian, a statue whose gaze has endured for nearly 5,000 years, staring into the horizon as empires rose and fell, as conquerors passed, as sands buried and uncovered it, and as the modern world puzzled over its secrets, making Khafre not merely a king of Egypt, but a king of eternity, remembered not only for stone piled high, but for the living face of mystery carved into the desert itself. Menkaure and the Last Pyramid of Giza, a dimming flame of glory. After the towering ambitions of Khufu and Khafre, the Giza Plateau received its final jewel in the reign of Menkaure, the son of Khafre, who ascended the throne around 2490 BCE, and whose vision, while more modest in scale, was no less profound in meaning. For though his pyramids stood smaller than those of his father and grandfather, rising to only about 215 feet, less than half the height of Khufu's colossal monument, it was crafted with an elegance and refinement that spoke not of diminished greatness, but of a deliberate shift in royal ideology, a recognition that grandeur could also be expressed in intimacy, and permanence in perfection rather than excess. Menkaure's pyramid, the smallest of the three great pyramids at Giza, was built partly of limestone and uniquely sheathed in red granite at its base, a rare and costly choice, for granite had to be quarried at Aswan, transported hundreds of miles down the Nile, and polished to a glowing finish, creating a dazzling contrast between the smooth white limestone above and the rich reddish sheen below. A visual statement that his tomb was not simply a continuation of tradition, but a reimagining of it, emphasizing both the strength of permanence and the warmth of divine protection. Around his pyramid, three smaller queen's pyramids were constructed, likely for his wives or royal daughters, adding to the sense of a family necropolis, a more intimate gathering of the royal household in death, contrasting with the vast and imposing complexes of Khufu and Khafre. The mortuary temple of Menkaure, unlike those of his predecessors, tells us something critical about the changing fortunes of Egypt, for it was left incomplete at the king's death, its limestone walls finished hastily in mud brick by his successor, a sign that resources, manpower, or perhaps the very will to sustain such massive projects was beginning to wane. And yet, within that temple and the valley temple connected by a causeway, archaeologists uncovered some of the most exquisite masterpieces of Egyptian art ever created. Triad statues of Menkaure, flanked by the goddess Hathor and regional deities, carved in dark gray-green schist with astonishing grace, portraying the king not as a distant colossus, but as a youthful, vigorous, almost approachable figure, standing in perfect balance, embodying both divine strength and human vitality. His calm features radiating confidence and eternal serenity. These statues, smaller in size but infinite in artistry, suggest that Menkaure's reign placed emphasis not only on monumental scale, but on spiritual depth, on the king's role as mediator between gods and people, protector of regions, and guarantor of fertility and life, showing us that the ideology of kingship itself was evolving, shifting from sheer displays of power toward more personal expressions of divine connection. Legends surround Menkare's pyramid as well. According to later Greek writers like Herodotus, who visited Giza 2,000 years after Menkare's time, the king was remembered as gentler and more just than his predecessors, beloved by his people for his fairness, a ruler whose reign was marked not by tyranny but by compassion. Yet even so, his pyramid was said to have suffered desecration by later kings or foreign invaders, and in modern times, the structure still bears scars of violence. For in the 12th century CE, the Kurdish ruler Al-Aziz Uthman, son of Saladin, attempted to demolish the pyramids, beginning with Menkare's, only to discover that the stone resisted their hammers and fire, leaving behind the great vertical gash we still see carved into its northern face, a wound across time that testifies both to human defiance and the enduring strength of Egyptian stonecraft. Thus, Menkare's pyramid, though smaller, has carried its story through ages of reverence, neglect, and attack, always surviving as a reminder that the flame of Egypt's pyramid age, though flickering, was not extinguished without leaving light. In Menkare's reign, we glimpse the pivot point of the Old Kingdom, the final pyramid at Giza standing not as a failure of ambition, but as a refinement of vision, a quieter, subtler assertion of eternity, accompanied by statues that remain among the highest achievements of Egyptian sculpture. Together, pyramid and art remind us that Egypt's greatness was not only in size, but in spirit, not only in engineering, but in the intimate humanity with which kings chose to portray themselves. And in this, Menkare carved his own eternal legacy, ensuring that his name, though less thunderous than Khufu's, would still echo across millennia. Yet his reign also marked the last blaze of pyramid building at its golden height, for the dynasties that followed would face growing challenges: economic strain, political turmoil, droughts that threatened the Nile's generosity. And though pyramids would continue to be built, none would ever again reach the perfection and scale of those at Giza. Menkare's pyramid was thus both an ending and a transition, the final brushstroke on Egypt's most famous canvas, a monument that whispers not of decline, but of change, of a civilization turning its gaze from towering stone toward other expressions of eternity. And as the desert winds swept over the plateau, wrapping the pyramids of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkare in silence, the world's greatest necropolis stood complete, a city of eternity where kings slept beneath mountains of stone, guarded forever by the watchful eyes of the Sphinx. The fall of the Old Kingdom, when eternity trembled. For centuries, the Old Kingdom had stood as the dazzling age of the pyramids, a time when pharaohs commanded the labor of tens of thousands, when stone monuments rose toward the heavens, and when Egypt's kings seemed as eternal as the gods themselves. Yet by the close of the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BCE, the glittering facade of permanence began to crack. For behind the mountains of stone lay the fragile reality of a kingdom stretched too far, drained by the very monuments that symbolized its divine order. Pyramid building, once a proud expression of eternity, had consumed colossal resources. Quarries emptied, forests stripped for sledges and boats, workers fed and housed at immense cost. And as each king tried to outdo his predecessor, the state treasury was strained to breaking, even as the power of provincial governors, the nomarchs, grew stronger. For while the pharaohs built in stone, the nomarchs built their own local bases of wealth, land, and loyalty, slowly decentralizing the power that once flowed solely to the king. This political fragmentation coincided with something even more devastating. Nature itself turned against Egypt, as evidence from Nile flood records and climate data reveals that around this time, the river that had been Egypt's lifeblood faltered. its annual inundations becoming irregular, weak, or failing altogether, plunging the land into drought and famine. Crops withered, granaries emptied, and the people who once glorified their kings now starved under their reign. The consequences were catastrophic. Inscriptions from tombs and later writings speak of a time when the Nile did not rise, when brothers turned against brothers, when villages were abandoned, and when hunger drove people to violence, shattering the social order that had bound Egypt together. The pharaoh, once the unchallenged center of the cosmos, the guarantor of Ma'at, balance, order, and justice, appeared powerless before the chaos. And in this failure, the very legitimacy of kingship began to crumble. For what good was a divine ruler if he could not feed his people or protect them from disaster? By the reign of Pepi II, whose astonishingly long rule may have stretched over 90 years, the Old Kingdom was a shadow of itself, its aged king presiding over a kingdom slipping through his fingers, the once mighty central authority dissolving into a patchwork of independent provinces, each ruled by ambitious nomarchs who acted like miniature pharaohs, raising their own tombs, commanding their own militias, and hoarding their own harvests. Egypt, once unified under the soaring vision of Djoser, Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre, fractured into a land of competing powers, its golden age collapsing not with a bang, but with a slow suffocation, as famine, drought, and political weakness strangled the dream of eternity. Yet out of this chaos also came voices preserved in texts like the admonitions of Ipuwer, lamenting a world turned upside down. The river is blood, men thirst for water. The nobles hunger, and the poor feast. Servants have become masters. A haunting record of despair that shows us the depth of Egypt's suffering and the inversion of its cosmic order, for Ma'at had been overturned, and with it, the very idea of Pharaoh's divinity seemed broken. Pyramids, those eternal mountains of stone, still loomed on the horizon, but they were silent, mute relics of a greatness that the starving masses could no longer feel or trust. Monuments mocked by the emptiness of their granaries and the collapse of their daily lives. Thus, the Old Kingdom, which had given the world its most iconic symbols of eternity, ended not in triumph but in ruin, ushering in what historians call the First Intermediate Period, an age of darkness and disunity, where Egypt was torn between rival dynasties in Heracleopolis and Thebes, where tombs were looted, temples abandoned, and art lost its refinement, reflecting a land adrift without the guiding hand of Ma'at. And yet, in this collapse lay the seeds of transformation. For though the Old Kingdom died, Egypt itself did not. It endured, scarred but alive, waiting for new leaders, new visions, and new ways of understanding the eternal. For the belief in the afterlife, in gods, in the cycle of rebirth, was too deeply woven into the Egyptian soul to vanish with famine or war. And so, while the great pyramids of Giza stood as silent sentinels over a land in chaos, the spirit of Egypt survived, ready to be reborn in the Middle Kingdom, where unity would be restored, art refined, and new forms of tombs and monuments would rise from the lessons of the Old Kingdom's collapse. But in this moment, at the dawn of the First Intermediate Period, the eternal order trembled, the voice of Pharaoh fell silent, and the world's greatest civilization tasted fragility for the first time, reminding us that even those who build for eternity cannot escape the tides of time. The First Intermediate Period, Egypt in shadow. When the last light of the Old Kingdom faded and the great kings of Memphis were no longer able to command the floods of the Nile nor the loyalty of their governors, Egypt slipped into one of its darkest ages, a time historians call the First Intermediate Period, circa 2181 to 2055 BCE. Though to those who lived it, it must have felt less like an intermediate pause and more like the end of the world they had always known. Famine swept across the Nile Valley as the river's annual floods, once so steady and life-giving, failed again and again. The waters receding too low to nourish the black silt that gave Egypt its bread, leaving fields cracked and dry beneath a merciless sun, while granaries emptied and hunger drove villages into despair. And what had once been the kingdom of eternal order descended into chaos, Isfet, the great antithesis of Ma'at, spreading through the land. Tomb inscriptions and later writings speak with haunting clarity of the suffering. Families scavenging for scraps, nobles reduced to begging, servants rebelling against their masters, and even whispers of cannibalism in the worst years of famine. A nightmare inversion of Egyptian society where the delicate balance of cosmic order, upheld by Pharaoh for generations, seemed utterly broken. In this vacuum of power, the nomarchs, provincial governors, who once acted as loyal stewards of the pharaoh's will, stepped into the void, their independence growing as central authority weakened. They became rulers of their own domains, controlling land, taxes, militias, and temples, carving their own names into stone as if they were pharaohs in miniature, building tombs with inscriptions boasting of their generosity to the hungry. I gave bread to the starving. I gave clothes to the naked. I buried the dead when no one else would. Declarations that reveal both their humanity and their ambition, for in a time when Pharaoh was silent, local lords sought to prove themselves as protectors of Ma'at. But ambition bred rivalry, and Egypt fractured into competing centers of power, with Heracleopolis in Lower Egypt claiming kingship through the 9th and 10th dynasties, while Thebes in Upper Egypt, led by the 11th dynasty, rose as a rival, and between them stretched a land of shifting alliances, local wars, and endless instability, where villages pledged loyalty not to a distant king, but to whichever warlord could protect them in the moment. The art and culture of this era reflect the instability with striking honesty. Gone were the polished perfection and divine idealism of Old Kingdom sculpture, replaced by rougher, more provincial works, smaller tombs built in local stone, reliefs less refined but deeply personal, often filled with scenes of daily life, farmers sowing seeds, herders guiding cattle, women baking bread, soldiers drilling with spears and shields, as if eternity itself had narrowed its gaze from cosmic harmony to the immediate struggle of survival. Wooden statues replaced costly stone, painted coffins replaced grand sarcophagi, and hieroglyphic inscriptions sometimes grew clumsy or abbreviated, all reflecting both the decline of centralized wealth and the raw humanity of the times. Yet, this rawness, there was also a kind of democratization of eternity. For no longer was the afterlife the exclusive domain of pharaohs with their pyramids, but even provincial lords and middle officials claimed their share of immortality, inscribing prayers and offering formulas in their tombs, expanding the reach of religious belief beyond the royal court to ordinary people in a way that would echo through later ages. Literature, too, took on a new and haunting voice as Egyptians sought to make sense of their suffering. The admonitions of Ipuwer, though written later, paints a vivid portrait of the chaos. The river is blood, men thirst for water, nobles hunger, servants are full, the land turns as does a potter's wheel. Lines that reveal a world where all order was inverted, where the very foundations of life had cracked. Other texts, like the Dialogue of a Man with His Soul, express deep despair, even suicidal longing, yet also resilience, as men debated whether life was still worth living in times of endless hardship. And then there were stories of wise rulers, of just men feeding the hungry and restoring order, tales that hinted at hope and foreshadowed the eventual rise of strong kings who would bring unity once more. These voices, raw and emotional, give us an intimate window into the hearts of people living through collapse, showing us Egypt not as a civilization of only gods and pyramids, but as a land of farmers, scribes, mothers, and soldiers enduring the weight of chaos. And yet, amid the hunger and strife, Egypt's spirit did not vanish. The Heracleopian kings, though weak compared to the giants of the Old Kingdom, still claimed legitimacy. building modest temples and maintaining rituals of kingship. While in Thebes, ambitious rulers like Intef I and Intef II asserted themselves as pharaohs, raising small but determined armies, sending expeditions into Nubia, and carving their names into history. Inscriptions from Thebes proclaim that they restored Ma'at and fed the hungry, rhetorical flourishes aimed at contrasting their strength with the weakness of Heracleopolis. And slowly, through battle and diplomacy, the tide shifted in their favor, culminating in the rise of Mentuhotep II, the Theban king who would eventually crush his rivals, reunite the two lands, and end more than a century of fragmentation. But before that triumph, generations of Egyptians lived through uncertainty, their lives shaped less by pyramids and palaces than by the daily question of survival. And their culture reflects this. Humbler, harsher, but also profoundly human. A reminder that even the greatest civilizations are not invulnerable, that eternity itself can be shaken, and that sometimes the most enduring legacy of a dark age is not its monuments, but its testimony to human resilience. Thus, the first intermediate period stands as a scar and a lesson in Egypt's history, a time when the Nile betrayed its people, when kings faltered, when famine humbled the mighty and gave voice to the ordinary, when art lost its polish but gained intimacy, when chaos ruled but the dream of order never fully died. And though later ages would look back on it as a time of shame, calling it a period of weakness and decline, it was also a crucible in which Egypt was tested, a night through which it had to walk before the dawn of the Middle Kingdom, when unity, vision, and power would return with new brilliance. But in this shadowed chapter, with pyramids silent and the Sphinx half buried in sand, Egypt confronted its own mortality, proving that even civilizations built for eternity can stumble, yet also that they can rise again. The Middle Kingdom, Egypt's renaissance under Mentuhotep II. Out of the long darkness of the first intermediate period, when famine, rebellion, and division had scarred the Nile Valley for generations, there arose in Thebes a king who would change Egypt's destiny. Mentuhotep II, circa 2061 to 2010 BCE. Remembered by later ages as the unifier, the restorer, the pharaoh who reforged the two lands into one after more than a century of chaos. His rise was not swift nor easy, for Thebes had to claw its way against the rival dynasty at Heracleopolis, through campaigns fought year after year along the Nile, with soldiers marching through fields that had once been peaceful farmlands, now turned into battlegrounds where villages swore shifting loyalties. But eventually, Mentuhotep's perseverance, vision, and divine claim tipped the balance. And around 2055 BCE, he achieved what many thought impossible: the reunification of Egypt, binding Upper and Lower Egypt once more under a single crown. In this act, he became more than a man. He was hailed as a living Horus, the divine falcon, sent by the gods to restore Ma'at, the sacred order that famine and chaos had torn apart. And in his reign, the people saw not merely a king, but salvation itself, the answer to prayers whispered for a century in the shadows of despair. The unification of Egypt under Mentuhotep II did more than heal political fractures. It launched what historians call the Middle Kingdom, circa 2055 to 1650 BCE. A period many later Egyptians would remember as a golden age of balance, justice, and renewed prosperity, a time when the Nile once again gave its floods generously, when granaries filled and temples rang with chants, when art regained beauty, but now carried a deeper realism shaped by memories of hardship. Mentuhotep's great mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, nestled against the cliffs at Thebes, symbolized this rebirth. Unlike the colossal pyramids of the Old Kingdom, his temple was a fusion of architecture and nature. Terraces rising like steps of light against the mountains, colonnades embracing the desert, sanctuaries aligned with the path of the sun, a sacred marriage of earth and eternity that inspired future generations, including the later queen Hatshepsut, who would build her own masterpiece beside his. In this temple, Mentuhotep declared his divine kingship, portraying himself not just as pharaoh, but as a god, one with Osiris, lord of the underworld, thereby redefining the very image of kingship into something both political and spiritual, human and eternal. Under Mentuhotep and his successors, Egypt's government was reshaped. The unchecked power of the nomarchs, which had fueled division during the First Intermediate Period, was curbed, as Pharaoh and his officials reasserted central control, creating a more balanced administration where provincial governors still held authority but under tighter royal oversight. Scribes flourished as never before, recording taxes, organizing labor, and standardizing laws. For the Middle Kingdom prized order through bureaucracy, an invisible machine of papyrus, ink, and calculation that ensured Egypt's vast wealth was managed. Yet this order was not cold. It was infused with ideals of justice, fairness, and responsibility, for Middle Kingdom texts speak often of Pharaoh as a shepherd of his people, a king not distant in pyramids, but present in justice, a man expected to listen to petitions, protect the poor, and embody Ma'at not only in ritual but in governance itself, creating an image of rulership that would endure for centuries. Culturally, the Middle Kingdom shone with brilliance. Art and literature, once raw and provincial during the First Intermediate Period, blossomed into new sophistication. Statues regained their elegance, but no longer were they the flawless, idealized images of Old Kingdom kings. Instead, Middle Kingdom pharaohs were often depicted with lined faces, heavy eyelids, and a hint of weariness, symbols of wisdom, humanity, and the burden of rule. An acknowledgement that kings were not just divine, but also men who carried responsibility for all Egypt. Literature reached heights unmatched before, with works like The Tale of Sinuhe, telling of a courtier who flees Egypt into exile, struggles abroad, then returns to be forgiven by Pharaoh, a story rich with themes of loyalty, identity, and redemption that reveals a civilization now turning inward, reflecting on the human condition, not merely celebrating divine kingship. Hymns, dialogues, and wisdom texts flourished, teaching virtues of humility, fairness, and resilience, echoing lessons learned in the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. Economically and militarily, Mentuhotep and his successors looked outward, sending expeditions into Nubia, reclaiming lost lands and their vital gold mines, pushing into Sinai for copper and turquoise, re-establishing trade with the Levant for cedarwood, incense, and exotic goods, reconnecting Egypt with the wider world. Fortresses rose along Nubia's Nile banks, massive mud brick citadels that not only controlled trade routes but stood as symbols of Egypt's renewed strength, their walls echoing with the footsteps of garrisons, their granaries stocked, their temples singing praises to Pharaoh's might. These expansions were not reckless conquest, but careful strategy, ensuring Egypt's wealth, security, and divine aura were reasserted beyond its borders. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Middle Kingdom was its soulful humanity, its art, its writing, its politics, all infused with lessons of fragility, humility, and justice, born out of the traumas of collapse. Where the Old Kingdom had been pyramids and gods, and the First Intermediate Period had been famine and survival, the Middle Kingdom was the synthesis, a civilization wiser, more grounded, yet still reaching for eternity. Mentuhotep II's reign set the stage, but his successors, kings like Amenemhat I and Senusret I, would carry the vision forward, building cities, reorganizing the state, and creating a cultural identity that Egyptians for centuries would look back on as an age of balance, order, and meaning. Thus, the Middle Kingdom began, not with the arrogance of unshakable kings, but with the resilience of a nation that had known despair, survived it, and now sought to live not only for eternity in stone, but in wisdom, justice, and the memory of human endurance. The Nile's waters once again kissed the fields, the temples once again filled with incense, and Egypt, reborn, stood ready for a new chapter, scarred by the past, yet stronger because of it. Amenemhat I, Senuseret I, and the Golden Age of the Middle Kingdom. When the long reign of Mentuhotep II ended and Egypt had been reunited, the torch of destiny passed to a new dynasty, one that would secure and expand the rebirth he had begun. The 12th dynasty, founded by Amenemhat I around 1985 BCE, a man of vision, cunning, and reform. Unlike the kings of old who inherited thrones through ancient lines, Amenemhat was not born into power, but rose through skill, perhaps once a vizier before he seized the crown. Proving that even in Egypt, the eternal land of tradition, a man of talent could carve his name into eternity. To secure his rule, he moved Egypt's capital northward to a new city he built, Ich-Tawi, strategically placed near the Fayum oasis, closer to both Upper and Lower Egypt, symbolizing his intent to bind the two lands tightly and to watch both the Nile Valley and the Delta with equal vigilance, ensuring no rival could fracture the unity so painfully restored. From here, he reorganized the administration, reducing the power of nomarchs, who had nearly torn Egypt apart during the First Intermediate Period, creating instead a bureaucracy that answered directly to the crown, staffed by scribes and officials whose loyalty was tied not to provinces but to Pharaoh himself. A system that would stabilize Egypt for generations and ensure that the disasters of the past would not easily return. Amenemhat was not content with mere stability. He sought legitimacy through divine association, linking himself to the gods and claiming descent from Re, the sun god, while also presenting himself as a king of wisdom and justice. He commissioned texts like the Instruction of Amenemhat, a wisdom teaching in which the king, speaking even after his death, warns his son of betrayal, recounting how conspirators once struck against him and urging vigilance. A haunting reminder that even pharaohs were not beyond mortal danger, but also a timeless piece of advice that reflects the political sophistication of the Middle Kingdom. And though Amenemhat I was indeed assassinated, his legacy did not collapse, for he had wisely co-ruled with his son, establishing the system of co-regency, where the heir ruled alongside Pharaoh before succession, ensuring smooth transitions of power. A brilliant innovation that protected the dynasty from the chaos of disputed thrones and allowed Egypt to flourish without interruption. That son was Senuseret I, one of the greatest kings of the Middle Kingdom, who took his father's vision and turned it into golden reality. Senuseret expanded Egypt's borders with vigor, launching campaigns into Nubia, where he built massive fortresses, mud brick citadels with towering walls, storehouses, and temples, symbols of Egypt's iron grip on the gold mines, cattle pastures, and trade routes of the south, while also pushing east into the Sinai for turquoise and copper, and west toward Libya, ensuring Egypt was ringed not by enemies but by frontiers that echoed with Egyptian banners. His armies were not vast like later empires, but disciplined, well-supplied, and loyal. And his policy of fortification made Egypt secure in a way it had not been in centuries. Yet Senuseret was not merely a warrior. He was also a builder and a patron of the gods. He expanded temples across the land, erecting obelisks, shrines, and sanctuaries, most famously at Karnak, where he began the tradition of monumental building that would eventually make it one of the most sacred and awe-inspiring temples in the ancient world. His white chapel, with exquisitely carved reliefs of gnomes bringing offerings to Pharaoh, stands as a masterpiece of Middle Kingdom art. Its precision, elegance, and harmony reflecting the renewed prosperity of Egypt under his rule. Under Amenemhat I and Senusret I, and later their successors, Senusret II, Senusret III, and Amenemhat III, Egypt experienced what many historians call a golden age of balance. The bureaucracy flourished, agriculture expanded with irrigation projects in the Fayum Basin, reclaiming land from the marshes to feed a growing population. Trade networks pulsed with activity, bringing incense from Punt, cedarwood from Byblos, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, and exotic goods that dazzled Egyptian elites. Literature blossomed, not merely as hymns to the gods, but as sophisticated works of storytelling, reflection, and philosophy. Tales like The Story of the Shipwrecked Sailor, where a man lost at sea meets a magical serpent, or the enduring masterpiece The Tale of Sinuhe, blending adventure with introspection, exploring themes of exile, identity, and homecoming. Texts so powerful they were copied by scribes for centuries as models of wisdom and art. Egyptian poetry reached new emotional depths. Hymns celebrated Pharaoh not only as a god, but as a just shepherd of his people. And wisdom texts instructed officials on how to live with humility, fairness, and devotion to Ma'at, reflecting a society that valued justice as much as power. What makes the Middle Kingdom under Amenemhat and Senusret so striking is its humanity. The art shows pharaohs not as flawless immortals, but as wise, careworn leaders with heavy eyes and furrowed brows, men who carried the burden of rulership honestly. The literature explores not only divine order, but human doubts and fears, the fragility of life, the longing for belonging, themes that resonate across time, making this era feel closer to us than the remote grandeur of the Old Kingdom. Egypt was powerful, yes, but it was also reflective, philosophical, and deeply human, shaped by its memories of collapse and guided by rulers who sought not only glory, but stability and justice. Thus, under Amenemhat I and Senusret I, Egypt entered a golden chapter where fields once again bloomed with wheat, temples echoed with hymns, fortresses guarded the borders, and scribes filled papyri with wisdom and stories that would endure for millennia. It was an age when Pharaoh was strong yet wise, distant yet human, when the scars of the first intermediate period gave way to a flowering of resilience, vision, and art, the Middle Kingdom's heart, beating with the rhythm of the Nile, steady and eternal once more. Senusret III and Amenemhat III, the pinnacle of Middle Kingdom power. If Amenemhat I and Senusret I had laid the solid foundations of the Middle Kingdom, then it was Senusret III, circa 1878 to 1839 BCE, who embodied its raw might, its unflinching discipline, and its vision of Pharaoh as not only a divine shepherd, but a warrior king whose will could bend the Nile Valley and its neighbors to Egypt's command. Towering in history as one of the most formidable kings ever to wear the double crown, Senusret III launched relentless campaigns into Nubia, not content with holding fortresses at the border, but pressing far south, seizing lands deep beyond the Second Cataract, building colossal mud brick fortresses at places like Buhen, Semna, and Uranarti, whose walls bristled with watchtowers and whose inscriptions proudly declared Pharaoh's might. One famous stela warns that no Nubian shall ever pass except for trade or tribute, a chilling proclamation of total control. For Senusret was determined that Egypt's southern frontier would never again be vulnerable. His armies were disciplined, his officers loyal, his policy ruthless but effective, and in this militarization, Egypt gained not only gold and cattle, but also security, ensuring that the wealth of Nubia flowed steadily north into Egyptian temples and treasuries. Yet Senusret's vision was not confined to conquest alone. He redefined kingship itself, commissioning statues of himself with stern, careworn features, eyes heavy-lidded, mouth set in grim determination, a face not of serene divinity, but of human strength, endurance, and responsibility. These statues, strikingly realistic compared to earlier art, reflect a philosophy of leadership born from memory of chaos. Pharaoh was no longer merely a god smiling eternally, but a man shouldering the weight of all Egypt, embodying resilience, vigilance, and resolve. A new archetype of kingship that would echo for centuries. While Senusret III carved Egypt's southern empire, he also turned inward to strengthen its administration, reducing the lingering power of the nomarchs by replacing hereditary provincial offices with royal appointees, ensuring that loyalty flowed directly to the crown. Scribes, tax collectors, and officials reported to Pharaoh's court at Ichtawi, and through papyri and sealings, we glimpse a machine-like bureaucracy that regulated everything from grain storage to border patrols, creating an Egypt that was more centralized, efficient, and secure than it had ever been before. Literature and ideology also mirrored this new order, producing texts like the Instructions of Amenemhat, which warned heirs of betrayal, and hymns praising Senusret as a warrior of iron and a bringer of justice, while ordinary Egyptians composed songs and tales that celebrated the strong kings who restored balance after centuries of turmoil. Yet for all his ruthlessness, Senusret III was not remembered as a tyrant, but as a hero. Later generations even worshipped him as a god, especially in Nubia, where temples to his cult were built, proving that his aura extended beyond politics into the realm of the divine. Following in this path came Amenemhat III, circa 1860 to 1814 BCE, often regarded as the greatest builder and most accomplished administrator of the Middle Kingdom, whose reign turned Egypt's prosperity into monumental reality. He is remembered for his vast building projects, his engineering marvels, and his keen eye for economic expansion. Under his rule, the Fayum Depression was transformed into a fertile agricultural basin through canals and irrigation works, one of the greatest feats of water management in the ancient world, reclaiming land from marshes and turning it into grain fields that sustained Egypt's population for centuries. He also commissioned massive temples, pyramids, and the legendary labyrinth at Hawara, described by Greek writers like Herodotus as more astonishing than even the pyramids themselves. A colossal mortuary complex with endless halls, chambers, and courtyards designed to awe visitors and to honor both the gods and the enduring might of Pharaoh. Though his pyramids at Dashur and Hawara suffered structural flaws, the scale of his ambition remains breathtaking, a testament to Egypt's wealth and organizational power during his reign. Though his pyramids at Dashur and Hawara suffered structural flaws, the scale of his ambition remains breathtaking, a testament to Egypt's wealth and organizational power during his reign. Amenemhat III also expanded trade and diplomacy on a scale unmatched in earlier times. Expeditions were sent to the turquoise mines of Sinai, the copper roots of the Eastern Desert, and the incense-rich lands of Punt, re-establishing Egypt's role as the central hub of a vast trade network that linked Africa, the Levant, and beyond. Inscriptions at Wadi Hammamat and Sinai record expeditions of thousands of men, overseen by royal officials, marching through deserts with donkeys, ships, and supplies, all to bring back treasures that filled temples and palaces. Nubia remained firmly under Egyptian control, its fortresses bustling with soldiers, traders, and priests, while Egyptian influence reached north into the Levant, where scarabs of Amenemhat III have been found in Canaanite cities, evidence of Egypt's prestige abroad. This was a time when Pharaoh's name carried weight across borders, when Egypt was not just a kingdom, but a cultural power whose art, architecture, and wealth inspired awe far beyond its Nile homeland. Culturally, the Middle Kingdom under Senusret III and Amenemhat III produced works of unparalleled depth and sophistication. Statues of kings with realistic features reflected not divine perfection, but human responsibility. Art that spoke to resilience rather than eternal ease. Literature reached new heights with compositions like the tale of the eloquent peasant, where a common man pleads eloquently for justice against a corrupt official, reflecting the Middle Kingdom's obsession with Ma'at as fairness and truth, and revealing a society where even the lowly could, in story, if not always in reality, claim the right to be heard. Wisdom texts taught humility, loyalty, and service, while love poems and songs revealed an Egypt that was not only orderly but deeply human, filled with joy, passion, and reflection on life's fleeting beauty. Thus, under the twin giants Senusret III and Amenemhat III, the Middle Kingdom reached its zenith. Militarily unshakable, economically prosperous, administratively efficient, artistically profound, and spiritually rich. It was a civilization that had survived collapse, reinvented itself with wisdom, and now shone with a brilliance that seemed eternal. But, as history so often reminds us, even the brightest lights eventually cast long shadows. And as the Middle Kingdom stretched toward its height, the seeds of its decline were quietly being sown. Pressures at the borders, exhaustion of resources, and the slow re-emergence of provincial power would one day test Egypt again. Yet for now, in the reigns of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, Egypt stood proud, united and glorious. Its temples gleaming in the sun, its canals carrying life through the Fayum, its armies unchallenged, and its pharaohs immortalized as both men and gods, the very embodiment of Ma'at restored. The decline of the Middle Kingdom and the coming of the Hyksos. After the monumental reigns of Senusret III and Amenemhat III, when Egypt's armies had secured Nubia, its canals had reshaped the Fayum, and its temples gleamed with offerings, the Middle Kingdom seemed invincible. Yet history, like the Nile itself, ebbs as well as floods. And the twilight of this golden age came not with sudden collapse, but with slow exhaustion, a steady draining of the strength that had made Egypt so mighty. Amenemhat III, for all his achievements, had stretched Egypt's resources to their limits. His irrigation projects required constant maintenance. His pyramids and colossal labyrinth consumed vast labor and wealth. His expeditions to Nubia, Sinai, and Punt demanded men and supplies. And as years passed, the machinery of the state grew heavy, strained by overextension. His successors, beginning with Amenemhat IV, inherited a throne weighed down by grandeur but lacking in vitality. And though Amenemhat IV ruled capably for a short time, sending expeditions abroad and maintaining Egypt's prestige, his reign was brief, leaving no strong legacy. His successor, the little-known Sobek-Neferu, one of the first women to rule as pharaoh in her own right, ascended around 1806 BCE. And though she carried herself with the authority of kingship, even adopting male regalia in statues and inscriptions, her reign lasted only a few years before ending abruptly, leaving no heir to continue the 12th dynasty. And with her death, the dynasty that had forged the Middle Kingdom's greatness flickered out like a flame at the end of its wick. What followed was the 13th dynasty, a line of kings who ruled not from strength, but from inertia. More than 60 rulers in about 150 years, many reigning only months or a handful of years. Their names recorded in king lists, but leaving little in the way of monuments or legacy. Power became fragmented once more, with pharaohs ruling from Ichtawi but struggling to command the full loyalty of their provinces, as local governors, officials, and foreign mercenaries gained influence. Though Egypt did not descend immediately into chaos as it had after the Old Kingdom, it became a kingdom of diminishing returns. Its monuments smaller, its art less ambitious, its administration clogged with instability, a shadow of the golden dynasty that had come before. Inscriptions from this era often repeat the same formulaic praises without the grandeur or innovation of earlier times, as though Egypt were surviving on habit rather than vision, continuing the rituals of Ma'at but with weakening conviction. Meanwhile, in the Eastern Delta, a new presence stirred. Groups of Asiatic peoples, often referred to as the Hyksos, from the Egyptian Heka Kasut, rulers of foreign lands, who had been migrating into Egypt for generations, drawn by fertile land, trade opportunities, and the wealth of the Nile. At first, they lived alongside Egyptians, working as traders, craftsmen, and even soldiers. But as central authority faltered, these migrants grew in power, establishing their own communities, intermarrying, and gradually blending Egyptian and Near Eastern culture. By the time the 14th dynasty emerged in the Delta, ruled by local chiefs with limited control, Egypt was no longer a united giant, but a patchwork of shifting authorities. The weak kings of the 13th dynasty clung to the throne at Ichtawi, while in the Delta, Asiatic rulers consolidated their own power bases. And in Nubia, the great fortresses once built by Senusret III faced challenges as native kingdoms like Kerma grew stronger, pressing against Egypt's southern frontier. The system that had seemed so solid under Senuseret III and Amenemhat III was now fraying, its edges pulled apart by foreign influence, economic strain, and internal instability. Slowly, the Hyksos in the Delta transformed from guests to masters, adopting Egyptian titles, building temples to Egyptian gods, and yet introducing new elements: horses, chariots, composite bows, and new fortification techniques, tools of war unknown to Egypt's armies, which had long relied on foot soldiers and simple weaponry. At first, their presence may not have seemed a threat, but as the 13th dynasty kings dwindled, the Hyksos rulers grew bolder, until eventually they established their own 15th dynasty, ruling from the city of Avaris in the eastern delta, controlling Lower Egypt outright. Thus began the Second Intermediate Period, 1782 to 1570 BCE, a time when Egypt was once again divided, its proud kingship humbled, its two lands fractured into at least three powers. The Hyksos dynasts in the north, the fading Egyptian kings of the 13th and later 16th dynasties in Middle Egypt, and the rising Theban dynasty in the south, which would eventually lead the struggle for liberation. But in these early years of Hyksos dominance, Egypt seemed adrift, its unity broken, its traditions strained, its monuments modest compared to the grandeur of the Middle Kingdom. And yet, just as before, the seeds of renewal were quietly growing in Thebes, where ambitious local rulers preserved Egyptian identity and prepared, over generations, to reclaim the land from foreign hands. For now, however, Egypt lived under foreign rulers, and though the Hyksos adopted many Egyptian customs, building temples to gods like Seth and taking on pharaonic titles, the Egyptian heart could not forget that its eternal order had been shaken, its crown divided, and its throne shared with strangers. The decline of the Middle Kingdom, then, was not a sudden fall, but a long, weary fading, like the sun sinking into the desert horizon. A slow draining of vigor, leaving space for new powers to rise. The legacy of Amenemhat and Senuseret endured in memory, in literature, and in the monuments that still stood proudly along the Nile. But their golden age had passed, and now Egypt stood on the threshold of one of its most humiliating yet transformative chapters: the struggle against the Hyksos, a struggle that would test its spirit, reshape its armies, and ultimately set the stage for the new kingdom, when Egypt would rise not only to unity but to empire. The Hyksos rule and the seeds of resistance. When the Hyksos seized control of the Delta and established their capital at Avaris, it marked a shot unlike anything Egypt had ever known. For the first time in nearly 1,000 years of kingship, the two lands were ruled not by a native pharaoh descended from Ra, but by foreign dynasts. Men who spoke a Semitic tongue, whose ancestors had come from Canaan and beyond, and who brought with them strange animals, weapons, and gods. Yet the Hyksos were not mere conquerors plundering Egypt, for they understood the immense prestige of the throne they had claimed, and so they dressed themselves in Egyptian regalia, adopted the pharaonic titulary, made offerings to Egyptian deities, and built temples in Egyptian style, especially venerating Seth, the storm god, whom they associated with their own Baal. Yet beneath this veneer of Egyptian tradition lay something new, a fusion of cultures that shocked the old order. They introduced horses and chariots, machines of speed and power unknown to Egypt, as well as the composite bow, capable of piercing armor at great distances, and advanced fortifications with earth ramparts and bastions, which made their cities nearly impregnable. With these innovations, they held the Nile Delta in a firm grip, turning Avaris into a bustling cosmopolitan hub of trade, linking Egypt with the Levant, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean, filling markets with foreign goods: silver from Anatolia, wine and oil from Canaan, timber from Lebanon, and exotic animals from the Near East, making Lower Egypt richer than ever, even as its cultural identity shifted under foreign dominance. For the people of the Delta, life under the Hyksos may have seemed less like occupation and more like transformation. Farmers still tended their fields along the life-giving Nile, craftsmen still carved scarabs and amulets with hieroglyphs, priests still performed sacred rituals to Ra and Osiris, yet foreign influences seeped into every aspect of life. Pottery styles blended with Canaanite designs, Egyptian words merged with Semitic names, and even the hieroglyphs recorded foreign rulers who had taken on Egyptian titles. The Hyksos pragmatism meant they allowed much of traditional Egyptian society to continue, but the humiliation of seeing Egypt's sacred crown worn by outsiders gnawed at the heart of its identity, especially in Thebes, the city of Amun, far to the south, where a native Egyptian dynasty of local rulers, the 17th dynasty, maintained a fragile autonomy, acknowledging Hyksos overlordship in name, but ruling their territories independently. In Thebes, the royal line traced back to warriors and provincial leaders who had risen from obscurity during the decline of the Middle Kingdom. And though they lacked the wealth and power of the Hyksos kings, they preserved the flame of Egyptian pride, holding on to the traditions of Pharaoh, building modest temples to Amun, and keeping alive the dream of unification. Their inscriptions often speak of feeding the people and restoring Ma'at, quiet but defiant statements in a time when Egypt's sacred orders seemed lost. Tension between Thebes and Avaris grew like a brewing storm, while Hyksos camps such as Apophis consolidated their power in the north. The Theban rulers, like Seqenenre-Tau, grew increasingly bold in their opposition, refusing to remain silent in the face of humiliation. One tale, preserved in later papyrus, tells of a quarrel between Apophis and Seqenenre, in which the Hyksos king complained that the hippopotamuses in Thebes' sacred pools kept him awake in Avaris, a demand so absurd it was clearly a political provocation, meant to humiliate the southern ruler. But it reveals the growing hostility between the two courts, a rivalry that could no longer be contained by diplomacy. Thebes began quietly preparing for war, studying Hyksos weapons, recruiting soldiers, and forging alliances with Nubians to the south, while also deepening their devotion to Amun, who was rising as the god of kingship and resistance, a divine protector who would one day empower Thebes to liberate all Egypt. The struggle was not only military but psychological. The memory of the great Middle Kingdom kings, Senusret, Amenemhat, Mentuhotep, lingered in the Egyptian consciousness, and in comparison, the Hyksos seemed interlopers, foreigners who might wear Egyptian crowns but could never truly embody the soul of Egypt. In tomb inscriptions and hymns of the period, we hear laments for the land divided, prayers for unity, and fierce declarations that one day Egypt would rise again. It is no coincidence that during this period, literature about past glories, such as tales of heroic kings and poems of national pride, flourished, for they served as both remembrance and inspiration, fueling the resistance movement in Thebes. Yet the Hyksos were not easy foes. Their armies were mobile, disciplined, and well-armed, their chariots a terror to infantry, their archers deadly at range. Egypt, long accustomed to slow-moving armies of spearmen, found itself outmatched, and the early clashes between Thebes and Avaris were bloody and inconclusive, with Seqenenre-Tau himself likely dying in battle, his mummy showing horrific wounds to the skull, axe blows and crushing strikes that suggest he fought or was executed at close quarters, a martyr to the cause of liberation. His sacrifice, however, lit the flame for his successors, Kamose and then Ahmose I, to continue the struggle, transforming the Theban resistance into a war of national survival. Thebes was no longer content to be a provincial dynasty. It now carried the hopes of all Egyptians who longed to drive out the foreigners and restore the glory of Pharaoh. Thus, during the Hyksos rule, Egypt lived in a strange duality. In the north, a cosmopolitan foreign dynasty prospered with trade, innovation, and power, reshaping Egyptian life in ways that would endure for centuries. While in the south, a proud but embattled dynasty clung to its traditions, gathering strength and dreaming of liberation. Between them stretched a land divided, weary of disunity, yearning for rebirth. The Second Intermediate Period was an age of humiliation, but also of transformation. For though the Hyksos had introduced weapons and technologies that humbled Egypt, they also unwittingly armed it with the tools it would one day use to defeat them, setting the stage for a final reckoning that would not only reunite the two lands, but propel Egypt into its greatest age of empire, the New Kingdom, the War of Liberation, from Second Enre-Tau to Ahmose I. The conflict that would decide Egypt's fate began not in one thunderclap of war, but in a simmering tension that could no longer be contained. The Hyksos kings at Avaris, confident in their chariots and bows, controlled the fertile delta, while the proud rulers of Thebes, calling themselves pharaohs in defiance, ruled the south under the rising power of Amun. The fragile peace collapsed during the reign of Second Enre-Tau, remembered as the brave, who confronted Hyksos' arrogance head-on, refusing to submit. And though the record is fragmentary, his death tells the story. His mummy bears deep gashes, horrific wounds to the skull and face, likely from Hyksos' battle axes, suggesting that he died either on the battlefield or captured and executed. His sacrifice a bloody spark that ignited the southern resistance. His widow, Queen Ahotep, became the guardian of the Theban throne, rallying warriors, keeping morale alive, and preserving the dynasty for her sons. A rare moment when a woman's strength held the kingdom together in its darkest hour. The struggle then fell to Ahmose, Second Enre's son, who inherited not just the throne, but the burning mission to drive out the foreigners. Ahmose launched daring campaigns northward, striking Hyksos strongholds and boasting in inscriptions that he drove the Asiatics to despair. Yet his victories were incomplete, for though he captured some fortresses and disrupted Hyksos trade, Avaris itself remained unconquered, and Ahmose too perished young, leaving the task unfinished. It was his brother, Ahmose I, who would rise as the true liberator, a warrior king hardened by years of turmoil, who gathered the strength of Thebes, trained his men in the very chariot warfare introduced by the Hyksos, forged alliances with Nubians to the south, and prepared for the decisive war. The battles that followed were not merely clashes of armies, but a war for Egypt's soul, fought city by city along the Nile. Ahmose marched north with a determination unlike any before, his army now equipped with chariots, bronze weapons, and composite bows. Once the tools of Egypt's enemies, now turned against them. His strategy was relentless, attacking Hyksos fortresses one after another, cutting off their supply lines and laying siege to their strongholds, while Theban ships controlled the river, ensuring that no retreat or reinforcement could easily reach Avaris. The Hyksos resisted fiercely, for they had ruled the delta for generations and considered it their rightful land. But Ahmose pressed on, his victories recorded by loyal soldiers like Ahmose, son of Abana, whose tomb inscriptions provide rare, vivid accounts of naval battles, hand-to-hand combat, and the glory of serving a king determined to restore Egypt. After years of struggle, the climax came with the siege of Avaris, the Hyksos' capital, where foreign dynasts made their last stand. The fighting was brutal, house to house and wall to wall, but Ahmose's forces prevailed, storming the city and shattering the Hyksos' hold on Lower Egypt. The survivors fled north into Canaan, but Ahmose pursued them beyond Egypt's borders, ensuring that no Hyksos dynasty could ever return, chasing them as far as Sharuhan in southern Palestine, which he besieged for 3 years before finally conquering it. A decisive blow that not only ended Hyksos' rule, but marked the dawn of a new era in Egyptian military ambition. The victory was not merely military, but spiritual and political. With the Hyksos expelled, Ahmose stood as the reunifier of the two lands, a pharaoh in the grand tradition of Narmer, Mentuhotep, and the kings of old, yet forged in fire and war. He restored temples desecrated during the Hyksos period, renewed offerings to the gods, and above all, elevated Amun of Thebes as the supreme deity. For it was under Amun's banner that Thebes had fought and triumphed, and now the god of hidden power became the protector of empire, his priests growing in wealth and influence alongside the kings. Amoso rewarded his loyal warriors with land and wealth, transforming Egypt's military class into a new elite. And he established fortresses in Nubia to secure the south, ensuring the flow of gold and resources, while also reasserting dominance over the delta to prevent any future invasion from Asia. The lessons of the Hyksos era were clear. Egypt could never again remain isolated and complacent, trusting only in the Nile's bounty. It had to look outward, to build an army of innovation and strength, to wield the very technologies that had once humbled it, and to project power beyond its borders to secure its heartland. Thus, with the Hyksos expulsion, Egypt emerged transformed, no longer a kingdom content with internal unity, but a rising power poised for expansion, its armies hardened, its kings emboldened, and its vision broadened beyond the Nile Valley. The Second Intermediate Period, with all its humiliation and division, had forged a new Egypt in fire, one ready to step onto the stage of empire. And under Ahmose and his successors, the land of the pharaohs would enter its most dazzling age, the New Kingdom, an era of conquest, wealth, monumental building, and immortal names. Yet the memory of Second Enre-Tawo's wounds, Kamosis' daring raids, and Ahmose's relentless campaigns remained etched into Egypt's soul, a reminder that even in its darkest hour, the spirit of Ma'at could be reclaimed through courage, sacrifice, and unyielding resolve. The rise of the New Kingdom, Egypt reborn in power and glory. With the Hyksos expelled and the land of the pharaohs once more united under Ahmose I, Egypt awoke like a sleeping giant, her spirit renewed, her armies hardened, and her eyes turned beyond the familiar flow of the Nile toward the deserts, mountains, and seas that bordered her. For the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, was not merely about restoration, it was about expansion, domination, and eternal legacy. Ahmose set the stage with sweeping reforms, rebuilding temples desecrated by foreign occupation, fortifying the southern border along Nubia to secure the gold and mineral wealth of the deserts, and establishing garrisons in the delta to prevent any return of Asiatic invaders, while also nurturing the growing power of the Amun priesthood, whose influence would intertwine religion and governance in ways that shaped Egyptian politics for centuries. His son, Amenhotep I, continued the work of consolidation and internal strengthening, commissioning magnificent constructions in Thebes, erecting temples adorned with intricate reliefs depicting victorious campaigns, and expanding irrigation projects that ensured the Nile's generosity could feed a population now swelling under peace and prosperity. But it was under Thutmose I, a man of both vision and military genius, that Egypt truly stretched its arms, sending armies north into the Levant and south into Nubia, subjugating rebellious tribes, securing trade routes, and forging a network of fortresses that projected the pharaoh's authority across a region that had once seemed vulnerable and fragmented. Thutmose's reign marked the beginning of an Egyptian empire, a kingdom whose power could influence distant lands, whose influence reached far beyond the Nile, and whose armies became legendary for their discipline, chariot tactics, and bronze weaponry that seemed unstoppable. The New Kingdom was also a golden age of monumental architecture, a period when ambition met artistry in stone and gold. Massive temples rose along the Nile, carved with hieroglyphs that recounted not only victories, but the very ideals of Ma'at, divine order, and the pharaoh's sacred role as intermediary between gods and men. While grand mortuary complexes like the Valley of the Kings replaced pyramids, blending secrecy, majesty, and spiritual sophistication to ensure that even death could not erode royal authority. Tombs were filled with treasures, ritual texts, and painted walls depicting journeys through the underworld, ensuring that the pharaoh's passage into eternity would be as glorious as his reign and life. Meanwhile, the New Kingdom's society thrived with unprecedented wealth and cosmopolitan exchange. Merchants brought lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cedar from Lebanon, and incense from Punt, while artisans, scribes, and craftsmen achieved new heights of skill, producing jewelry, furniture, and ceremonial objects of exquisite precision, reflecting a culture that had matured into an empire capable of both martial conquest and artistic mastery. Yet the expansion of empire was not merely about land or riches, it was a declaration of divine mandate, a living proof that the gods favored Egypt, that the pharaoh's might could transcend borders and bend the natural world to his will. Each military campaign, each monumental temple, each restored or newly constructed shrine was a statement of legitimacy, a proclamation that the chaos of the Second Intermediate Period was a distant memory, replaced now by discipline, prosperity, and imperial vision. And though these campaigns brought glory, they also carried the weight of logistics, diplomacy, and human cost. For soldiers marched through deserts, endured skirmishes in foreign lands, and returned with both treasures and tales of distant peoples, creating a network of political alliances and tributary states that expanded Egypt's influence while embedding the king's authority across cultures that were once strangers. The reigns of Ahmose, Amenhotep I, and Thutmose I thus set the template for the New Kingdom, a synthesis of military genius, architectural ambition, religious devotion, and cultural flourishing that elevated Egypt to a status unmatched in its history. A kingdom capable of immense power, yet still deeply tied to its sacred traditions. The lessons of the Hyksos period, that isolation could invite disaster, that unity required vigilance, and that Ma'at demanded both justice and strength, were etched into every stone, every decree, and every campaign, ensuring that Egypt would not only survive but thrive, reaching heights of political, artistic, and military achievement that would echo for millennia and inspire generations of kings who saw in the Nile not only a river, but the lifeblood of an eternal civilization poised to rule, expand, and endure. Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and the apex of Egyptian power. The New Kingdom reached a crescendo of political sophistication, wealth, and military mastery under the reigns of Hatshepsut and her stepson and co-regent Thutmose III, a period that transformed Egypt from a powerful nation into a sprawling empire whose influence stretched from the deserts of Nubia in the south to the cities of Syria and Canaan in the north. Hatshepsut, one of the rare female pharaohs, ascended the throne initially as regent for the young Thutmose III, but her vision and ambition soon placed her in the position of supreme ruler, a queen who adopted full royal titulary, dressed in the traditional nemez and false beard of kingship, and undertook projects that fused grandeur, diplomacy, and economic innovation, commissioning the temple at Deir el-Bahari, an architectural masterpiece that clings to the cliffs of the Theban necropolis, terraced and adorned with reliefs celebrating not war, but the harmonious partnership between the pharaoh and the gods, depicting her divine birth and her expeditions to Punt, where exotic goods like myrrh, frankincense, gold, and rare animals were brought to enrich both the economy and religious offerings, signaling Egypt's reach into distant lands through trade and diplomacy rather than solely through conquest. Hatshepsut's reign, lasting over 2 decades, was marked by stability, monumental construction, and unprecedented economic prosperity. But it was the shadow of Thutmose III, groomed to be a warrior king, that would soon transform Egypt into a military powerhouse. When he assumed full control, he unleashed campaigns that are still studied as brilliant examples of strategic genius, marching into the Levant with massive armies, securing vassal states, crushing rebellions, and returning with wealth, tribute, and exotic spoils that filled the coffers of temples and palaces alike, while simultaneously demonstrating a level of organization and logistics previously unseen, ensuring that supply lines, reconnaissance, and coordinated attacks maintained Egyptian dominance in foreign lands. Hatshepsut's reign, lasting over 2 decades, was marked by stability, monumental construction, and unprecedented economic prosperity. But it was the shadow of Thutmose III, groomed to be a warrior king, that would soon transform Egypt into a military powerhouse. When he assumed full control, he unleashed campaigns that are still studied as brilliant examples of strategic genius, marching into the Levant with massive armies, securing vassal states, crushing rebellions, and returning with wealth, tribute, and exotic spoils that filled the coffers of temples and palaces alike, while simultaneously demonstrating a level of organization and logistics previously unseen, ensuring that supply lines, reconnaissance, and coordinated attacks maintained Egyptian dominance in foreign lands. Thutmose III's military prowess was matched by his vision for Egypt's cultural and religious supremacy. He expanded the city of Thebes into a center of ceremonial and administrative power, overseeing the embellishment of the Karnak temple complex with towering pylons, obelisks carved from Aswan granite, and hypostyle halls that symbolized the pharaoh's divine authority. His victories immortalized in hieroglyphic reliefs that line the walls, recounting campaigns in places like Megiddo, where he famously orchestrated tactical maneuvers to outflank numerically superior forces. An early demonstration of maneuver warfare that cemented his reputation as the Napoleon of the Nile. Beyond warfare, the new kingdom flourished with art, science, and ritual. Tombs in the Valley of the Kings reached new heights of intricacy, adorned with vivid depictions of deities, cosmology, and the journey through the afterlife. Artisans mastered the use of gold, semi-precious stones, and colored pigments, creating statues, jewelry, and ceremonial objects that reflected both material wealth and religious devotion, while scribes recorded not only laws and decrees, but astronomical observations, medicinal texts, and tales of legendary kings, preserving knowledge that would resonate for centuries. The apex of Egyptian power under Hatshepsut and Thutmose III was also a delicate dance between religion and politics. Amun of Thebes, elevated to the pinnacle of the pantheon, became the divine patron of empire, legitimizing pharaoh's conquests and monumental projects alike. And priests wielded influence that interlinked with royal authority, creating a complex network of governance, divine justification, and wealth management that ensured the stability of a far-flung empire. Even as Thutmose III's army subdued distant territories, tribute flowed back to Egypt, enabling further expansion of temples, fortresses, and urban centers, fostering a golden age in which the wealth of conquered lands funded art, ritual, and monumental architecture, while diplomacy, marriage alliances, and cultural exchange ensured that Egyptian influence reached far beyond the battlefield. Yet behind the glories of empire lay challenges: the constant need to maintain loyalty among vassals, the risk of rebellion in distant lands, and the delicate balance between religious authority and royal power. It was in navigating these intricacies that Hatshepsut's wisdom and Thutmose III's decisiveness combined to cement the new kingdom's legacy, creating a period in which Egypt's military might, economic strength, architectural innovation, and cultural sophistication were unmatched. An era that not only reflected the lessons of prior periods of division and conquest, but projected a vision of a civilization that could dominate, endure, and inspire for millennia, forever etching the names of pharaohs and gods into the stones, temples, and hearts of history. The Amarna Revolution, Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the sun god's new dawn. The new kingdom, having reached unparalleled heights under Thutmose III and his predecessors, entered one of its most radical and enigmatic chapters under Amenhotep IV, who would soon be known as Akhenaten, a pharaoh whose reign would not only redefine Egyptian religion, but challenge centuries of tradition, artistic conventions, and the very understanding of divine kingship. Early in his rule, Akhenaten made the unprecedented decision to elevate the worship of Aten, the sun disk, above the traditional pantheon of gods, effectively establishing a form of monotheism that concentrated religious authority in a single, omnipotent, and all-encompassing deity whose rays touched both pharaoh and people alike, promising life, prosperity, and divine favor. This seismic shift in theology was supported and embodied by Queen Nefertiti, whose beauty, influence, and partnership with Akhenaten have become legendary, depicted in exquisite busts and reliefs showing her as not merely consort but co-regent, actively participating in ceremonies, rituals, and the governance of Egypt. A queen whose presence in art and statuary broke traditional molds by portraying her in positions of near equal power to the pharaoh, while also symbolizing the intimate connection between royal authority and the divine Aten. To house this revolution, Akhenaten abandoned Thebes, the traditional religious and administrative capital, and constructed a new city, Akhetaten, modern-day Amarna, a sun-drenched urban marvel meticulously planned to honor the Aten. With temples open to sunlight, shrines adorned with reliefs of the pharaoh and queen basking in the gods' rays, and administrative complexes designed to centralize political and religious power. The city's very layout reflected the theological vision of its ruler, combining architecture, art, and ideology into a cohesive statement of divine kingship. While artisans working in this new capital developed an artistic style that was unprecedented in Egyptian history, characterized by elongated limbs, intimate family scenes, naturalistic depictions, and a sense of movement and emotion rarely seen before, a visual language that communicated the intimate, life-giving presence of Aten, as well as the unprecedented humanization of pharaoh and queen. Yet the Amarna period was as politically complex as it was artistically and religiously revolutionary. Akhenaten faced the challenge of suppressing the entrenched power of the Amun priesthood, whose wealth and influence had rivaled that of the pharaoh himself, while also managing the delicate network of vassal states across the Levant and Nubia that had been secured by previous military campaigns. Letters, later discovered in the Amarna letters, reveal a web of diplomacy, intrigue, and appeals from foreign rulers seeking Egyptian favor or aid, demonstrating that Akhenaten's religious focus did not entirely eclipse the practical demands of empire, though his neglect of military campaigns and traditional governance created tensions that would later test his successors. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of this era is the duality between innovation and instability. Akhenaten's radical theology and artistic revolution enriched Egyptian culture with unparalleled creativity, introducing new forms of expression and new ways of understanding the pharaoh's relationship with the divine. Yet these same reforms undermined long-standing religious institutions, disrupted traditional cults, and sowed seeds of uncertainty that would unravel in the years following his death. The prominence of Nefertiti, the mystery surrounding Akhenaten's lineage, and the enigmatic co-regency with his son Tutankhaten, later Tutankhamun, illustrate a period of both brilliance and vulnerability, a time when Egypt's spiritual and political center shifted literally and metaphorically to the sun-drenched plains of Amarna, leaving behind monumental art, revolutionary architecture, and a theological experiment that would fascinate historians, archaeologists, and artists for centuries. Ultimately, Part 17 of Ancient Egypt's story captures a civilization at a crossroads, daring to challenge its own traditions in the pursuit of divine singularity, artistic innovation, and royal legitimacy. A chapter defined by light, both literal and metaphorical, illuminating the enduring tension between human ambition, religious devotion, and the fragile equilibrium that sustained one of history's greatest empires, leaving a legacy as mysterious and radiant as the sun disk itself. Tutankhamun and the restoration of Egypt. Following the radical and turbulent reign of Akhenaten, Egypt entered a period of cautious restoration under the young pharaoh Tutankhamun, originally named Tutankhhaten, whose ascent to the throne marked a deliberate and symbolic return to the traditional gods, temples, and religious practices that Akhenaten had so dramatically disrupted. Though ascending the throne as a mere child of approximately 9 or 10 years old, Tutankhamun's reign, guided largely by powerful advisors such as I and the general Horemheb, became a carefully orchestrated effort to repair both the spiritual and political fabric of the nation, reversing the elevation of Aten in favor of Amun-Ra and other long-established deities, reinstating priesthoods, reopening temples, and restoring ritual practices that reaffirmed the pharaoh's divine connection while placating a populace and religious elite disoriented by the Amarna Revolution. The young king's restoration efforts were far more than symbolic. They involved massive campaigns of art and architecture, erasing depictions of Akhenaten and Aten from monuments, restoring Thebes as the religious and administrative heart of Egypt, and commissioning statues, stelae, and temples that celebrated continuity, divine legitimacy, and the eternal power of the pharaoh. A visual and ritual affirmation that the gods had returned to favor and that the cosmic balance, or Ma'at, had been restored. Tutankhamun's reign also coincided with critical efforts to stabilize Egypt's foreign relations, repair trade networks, and reassert influence over territories weakened during the Amarna period. While military campaigns were limited compared to the grand conquests of Thutmose III, expeditions were undertaken to Nubia and Canaan to ensure the loyalty of vassals, secure tribute, and protect the borders of a kingdom recovering from ideological upheaval, demonstrating that even under a child king, Egyptian administration remained resilient and capable of projecting power abroad. At home, the treasures and funerary preparations commissioned for Tutankhamun reflected both traditional splendor and innovative artistry, blending old and new kingdom motifs with touches of Amarna naturalism, resulting in objects of exquisite craftsmanship, golden masks, jeweled pectorals, intricately carved chests, and ceremonial daggers that celebrated kingship, divinity, and the journey into the afterlife, preserving the pharaoh's legacy in a way that would captivate the modern world thousands of years later. Yet the restoration was not solely ceremonial. It was also a time of careful political maneuvering, as powerful advisors consolidated their own influence while mentoring the young king, ensuring the continuity of governance and maintaining the loyalty of both the elite and the common populace. Horemheb, in particular, emerged as a stabilizing figure, later ascending to the throne himself, demonstrating the delicate balance between child king authority and experienced oversight that allowed Egypt to recover from a decade of religious and cultural disruption. Despite Tutankhamun's brief reign of approximately 10 years, the period is immortalized not for military might or monumental construction, but for the meticulous restoration of tradition, the reaffirmation of cosmic and divine order, and the careful reweaving of a national identity that had been stretched and tested by Akhenaten's religious revolution, a testament to Egypt's resilience and the enduring importance of Ma'at in sustaining the kingdom's power, stability, and cultural legacy. Tutankhamun's death at a young age only deepened the aura of mystery surrounding him, but his tomb, discovered millennia later in the Valley of the Kings, would reveal a wealth of artifacts, ceremonial objects, and treasures that illuminated not only the artistry of the new kingdom, but also the story of a civilization that could adapt, recover, and honor its traditions even after profound upheaval, leaving a chapter in ancient Egypt's history that demonstrates the fragile yet enduring balance between human ambition, divine favor, and the eternal rhythm of the Nile that sustained one of the world's most extraordinary empires. Horemheb and the rise of the Ramesside dynasty. After the brief and dramatic reigns of Tutankhamun and his immediate successors, Egypt faced the challenge of securing political stability and reasserting central authority, a task masterfully undertaken by Horemheb, a seasoned military commander and advisor whose rise to the throne marked the restoration of strong, disciplined governance and the end of the residual turbulence from the Amarna period. Horemheb's reign was characterized by a deliberate erasure of Akhenaten's heretical innovations, the suppression of lingering dissent, and the reorganization of administrative and military structures to ensure that the pharaoh once again embodied both divine authority and earthly control, restoring confidence among officials, priests, and the populace alike, while meticulously codifying laws, reforms, and decrees that would serve as the blueprint for effective governance in the new kingdom. By systematically recording his achievements and highlighting the continuity of tradition, Horemheb positioned himself as the restorer of Ma'at, reinforcing the sacred balance between gods, pharaoh, and people, while simultaneously mentoring and preparing the transition to the Ramesside dynasty, which would dominate Egypt for the next century and produce some of its most celebrated pharaohs, including Ramesses I, Seti I, and the legendary Ramesses II. The rise of the Ramesside dynasty reflected both continuity and ambition, as Egypt sought to reclaim its former glory, strengthen its military presence in Nubia and the Levant, and consolidate trade networks that had faltered during the ideological upheavals of the Amarna period. Ramesses I, though ruling briefly, laid the foundations for his son, Seti I, whose reign combined military prowess, monumental construction, and religious devotion, reinforcing Egypt's presence on the international stage while demonstrating that the pharaoh was both warrior and god, a stabilizing figure whose authority emanated from divine favor and earthly competence alike. Seti I's campaigns in Syria and Nubia were meticulously documented in temples, reliefs, and inscriptions, emphasizing not only military victories but also the symbolic restoration of Egyptian hegemony, while his extensive building projects, from the temples of Abydos to additions at Karnak, celebrated both traditional gods and the enduring power of the royal house, blending architecture, art, and propaganda into a cohesive narrative of stability, divine legitimacy, and national pride. This era also witnessed the codification of royal succession, military organization, and state administration that would allow Ramesses II, Seti I's son, to inherit a kingdom firmly under central authority and prepared for one of the most storied reigns in Egyptian history. The consolidation achieved by Horemheb and the early Ramesside pharaohs provided the political, religious, and cultural framework that enabled Egypt to maintain internal stability, project power abroad, and continue monumental building projects, demonstrating that the lessons of the Amarna upheaval, of religious experimentation, the fragility of authority, and the need for centralized oversight had been carefully internalized and transformed into enduring strategies for governance. Ultimately, Part 19 of Ancient Egypt's history captures a period of careful restoration, consolidation, and preparation, highlighting how a civilization that had experienced radical religious revolution and political instability could rebuild its institutions, fortify its borders, and prepare for a golden era under the Ramesside dynasty, leaving a legacy of strategic vision, monumental achievement, and enduring influence that would shape the narrative of one of history's greatest empires for centuries to come. Ramesses II, the Pharaoh of Eternity. Among the great rulers of ancient Egypt, few have captured the imagination of historians, archaeologists, and the modern world as powerfully as Ramesses II, known to history as Ramesses the Great, whose reign of nearly 70 years, beginning around 1279 BCE, was not merely long but transformative, marking the apex of Egypt's political, military, and cultural influence during the New Kingdom. Ascending the throne at a time when Egypt had been restored to stability by Horemheb and his immediate successors, Ramesses inherited a kingdom poised for greatness. Yet his ambition extended far beyond mere preservation. He sought to immortalize his name, solidify Egypt's borders, expand its influence, and leave behind monuments that would proclaim both divine favor and human achievement for eternity. Early in his reign, Ramesses faced challenges in maintaining Egypt's dominance in the Levant and Nubia, confronting rival powers such as the Hittites, who had grown increasingly assertive, and the Libyans on Egypt's western front. His most famous military engagement, the Battle of Kadesh, though ultimately a stalemate, was transformed through monumental inscriptions, reliefs, and propagandistic narratives into a story of divine triumph and personal heroism, portraying Ramesses as a warrior king guided by the gods, particularly Amun-Ra, whose favor ensured the pharaoh's invincibility and reinforced the sacred bond between ruler and deity. Ramesses' genius was not confined to warfare. He was a master of architecture, art, and public spectacle, commissioning colossal statues, temples, and obelisks across Egypt that celebrated his reign and venerated the gods. The Ramesseum, his mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, featured massive statues of the pharaoh in seated grandeur, walls covered with intricate reliefs depicting battles, offerings, and divine interactions, and inscriptions that combined history, myth, and ideology into a single, overwhelming testament to his authority. Similarly, the temples at Abu Simbel, carved directly into mountains, served both religious and political purposes, asserting Egyptian power in Nubia while inspiring awe through monumental scale, and architectural ingenuity, aligning with celestial events to emphasize the pharaoh's cosmic significance. Beyond monumental construction, Ramesses ensured that his legacy permeated daily life, commissioning statues, stelae, and inscriptions throughout towns, temples, and borders, blending personal glorification with religious devotion and reinforcing the perception that Egypt itself existed through his divine mandate. The pharaoh's domestic policies also reflected extraordinary foresight and sophistication. He maintained a powerful bureaucracy, supported priests and scribes, and orchestrated a court that balanced power between military leaders, administrators, and religious officials, ensuring stability and continuity. His family life, with multiple queens, children, and heirs, further intertwined personal and political ambitions, producing an unprecedented number of royal monuments and funerary objects that preserved his lineage and authority in both earthly and spiritual realms. Ramesses' reign extended far beyond tangible achievements, leaving a psychological and cultural imprint on Egypt and its neighbors, inspiring future generations of pharaohs to emulate his grandeur, his military prowess, and his devotion to the gods. By the time of his death around 1213 BCE, Egypt had been transformed into a civilization of unparalleled wealth, power, and artistic accomplishment, and his mummified body, eventually discovered in the Valley of the Kings, served as a tangible connection to a ruler who had mastered both the earthly and divine, ensuring that his name, monuments, and story would endure for millennia. In essence, Part 20 encapsulates the life and legacy of Ramesses II, a pharaoh whose ambition, vision, and charisma elevated Egypt to the zenith of its power, whose architectural and artistic achievements continue to inspire awe, and whose strategic, religious, and cultural innovations secured a place for him in history as one of the most extraordinary and enduring rulers of the ancient world. A symbol of Egypt's ability to blend human genius with divine aspiration in the pursuit of eternal glory. The later Ramesside pharaohs and the twilight of the empire. Following the unparalleled reign of Ramesses II, Egypt entered a period marked by both continuity and growing challenges. As his successors, the later Ramesside pharaohs, struggled to maintain the vast empire he had established while facing internal and external pressures that would gradually erode the nation's dominance. His immediate successors, including Merneptah, Ramesses III, and subsequent rulers, inherited a kingdom wealthy in monuments, military prestige, and religious institutions, yet they confronted increasingly aggressive neighbors, including the Sea Peoples, Libyans, and Nubians, whose incursions threatened both borders and trade routes, compelling the pharaohs to devote considerable resources to defense, diplomacy, and military campaigns, while also navigating complex court intrigues and succession disputes that occasionally destabilized governance. Among these rulers, Ramesses III stands out as a valiant defender of Egypt, successfully repelling invasions and safeguarding the Nile Delta. Yet his reign also highlights the vulnerabilities of the late New Kingdom. The economic strain of maintaining armies, paying tribute, and funding monumental construction created financial pressures that manifested in labor unrest, corruption, and administrative inefficiencies, signaling a slow erosion of centralized control. This period also witnessed a cultural and religious shift, as the once dominant temples of Amun at Thebes accumulated unprecedented wealth and political influence, sometimes rivaling the pharaoh's authority and complicating state affairs, while local officials, provincial governors, and military leaders increasingly asserted autonomy, gradually weakening the cohesiveness of the empire. Simultaneously, ambitious scribes, artisans, and religious figures began experimenting with funerary practices, tomb construction, and ritual innovations that reflected both the wealth and the anxieties of a society keenly aware of mortality, divine favor, and the fragility of power. The later Ramesside pharaohs' monumental projects, though impressive, often revealed signs of diminishing resources and craftsmanship, indicating a kingdom that remained outwardly grand yet internally strained, reliant on traditional symbols of authority even as the mechanisms of centralized control faltered. Trade networks, once thriving from the Levant to Nubia, faced disruption from both military conflict and economic decline, while population pressures along the Nile, compounded by periodic low floods, challenged agricultural productivity, highlighting the delicate balance between natural resources and political stability in a civilization so deeply tied to the river. Ultimately, Part 22 captures a nuanced portrait of a once mighty empire confronting the realities of succession, resource management, and external threats. The later Ramesside pharaohs strove to maintain the grandeur of Egypt's past while navigating an increasingly complex and unstable political landscape, setting the stage for the eventual fragmentation of central authority and the transition into the Third Intermediate Period. It is a story of resilience, adaptation, and gradual decline, illustrating how even the most powerful civilizations face the inexorable pressures of time, environment, and human ambition, and how the monuments, temples, and tombs of this era, though sometimes smaller or less ornate, still stand as enduring testaments to the pharaoh's desire to assert divinity, legacy, and permanence in a world that was quietly shifting beneath their feet. Mummification and the journey to eternity. One of the most fascinating and enduring mysteries of ancient Egypt lies not in its colossal monuments, but in its meticulous treatment of the dead, a process that reflects the civilization's profound devotion to the afterlife and the belief that life extended beyond the mortal realm. The art and science of mummification evolved over centuries, reaching extraordinary sophistication during the New Kingdom and beyond, as priests, embalmers, and artisans developed methods to preserve the body with astonishing precision, guided by the conviction that the deceased's physical form was essential for the soul, or Ka, to recognize and inhabit in the next world. The process began with the careful removal of internal organs, each preserved separately in canopic jars, their contents guarded by protective deities whose vigilance ensured the deceased's survival in the afterlife, while the heart, considered the seat of intellect and emotion, remained in place, destined to be weighed against the feather of Ma'at in the Hall of Judgment, determining worthiness for eternal life. The body was then desiccated using natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture that drew out moisture, and meticulously wrapped in layers of linen imbued with resins, oils, and perfumes. Each fold performed with precise ritual and accompanied by prayers, spells, and incantations drawn from the Book of the Dead, ensuring protection against malevolent spirits and obstacles in the underworld. Elaborate amulets, charms, and figurines such as shabtis were inserted within the wrappings to serve as servants for the deceased in the afterlife, while the mummy itself was often adorned with masks, jewelry, and inscriptions, transforming the body into a sacred vessel capable of transcending mortal decay. Mummification was only part of a larger tapestry of funerary practices, which included monumental tomb construction, elaborate burial ceremonies, and offerings designed to sustain both the body and the spirit. Tombs were conceived as eternal homes, meticulously decorated with scenes of daily life, religious rituals, and interactions with gods, meant to provide comfort, guidance, and protection for the deceased's journey. Priests performed complex rituals to open the mouth of the mummy, granting the ability to breathe, speak, and eat in the next world, while the living maintained ongoing offerings of food, incense, and libations, establishing a continuous connection between the mortal and divine spheres. Beyond the technical and ceremonial aspects, mummification and funerary rites reveal a civilization obsessed with immortality, for the Egyptians believed that proper preparation, ritual observance, and adherence to religious law ensured a successful passage to the field of reeds, a paradisical realm mirroring life along the Nile, where the soul could live in peace, abundance, and communion with the gods. In this context, the tomb, the mummy, the spells, and the offerings were not merely symbolic, but functional, forming a spiritual infrastructure designed to safeguard life beyond death, to preserve identity, and to maintain cosmic order, illustrating the profound intersection of religion, science, art, and philosophy in Egyptian culture. Part 23 captures the meticulous artistry, spiritual depth, and cultural significance of mummification, showing how ancient Egypt's obsession with eternity shaped every aspect of life, death, and the sacred journey beyond, and how the preserved bodies, tombs, and rituals continue to mesmerize and educate modern generations about a civilization that sought to master time itself.
The Valley of the Kings. Tombs, treasures, and timeless mysteries. Nestled along the rugged cliffs of the Theban hills on the west bank of the Nile, the Valley of the Kings stands as one of the most enigmatic and awe-inspiring sights of ancient Egypt, a necropolis meticulously chosen for its seclusion, natural fortification, and symbolic connection to the West, the land of the dead, where pharaohs, queens, and high-ranking officials of the new kingdom were laid to rest in tombs designed to transcend mortality and ensure eternal life. For centuries, these hidden burial sites were shrouded in mystery, their locations carefully guarded by architects, priests, and laborers who sought to protect the pharaoh's eternal dwellings from tomb robbers, a task that required not only elaborate construction techniques, but also sophisticated security measures, from concealed entrances to labyrinthine corridors adorned with curses, warnings, and protective inscriptions meant to deter intruders and preserve the sacred treasures within. The tombs themselves, carved directly into limestone cliffs and elaborately decorated with vivid frescoes, reliefs, and inscriptions, served as spiritual maps of the afterlife, depicting the journey of the deceased through perilous realms, encounters with gods and demons, and the ultimate reunion with Osiris, ruler of the underworld. Walls were adorned with texts from the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and other funerary compositions, providing instructions for the soul to navigate traps, perform sacred rituals, and achieve immortality, transforming each tomb into both a physical and metaphysical passageway that reflected the pharaoh's status, devotion, and cosmic destiny.
The treasures within these tombs, from gilded funerary masks to intricate jewelry, ceremonial weapons, chariots, and pottery, reveal not only the immense wealth of the pharaohs, but also their belief in a life beyond death, where material possessions could be enjoyed, providing sustenance, status, and divine protection. Objects were often inscribed with spells or depictions of gods to ensure their efficacy in the afterlife,
while the meticulous arrangement of items reflected a sophisticated understanding of symbolism, ritual, and cosmic harmony. Yet despite these precautions, tomb raiding was a recurring threat throughout Egyptian history, leaving many sites plundered, defaced, or buried under centuries of sand and debris, which only added to their mystique and the allure of rediscovery. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that archaeologists, driven by a combination of scholarly curiosity and modern excavation techniques, began unveiling these hidden wonders, most famously the tomb of Tutankhamun, whose nearly intact treasures shocked the world and reignited global fascination with ancient Egypt. The discovery of golden masks, ceremonial chariots, painted coffins, and exquisite jewelry provided a tangible connection to the grandeur of the new kingdom and the ingenuity of its artisans, while also revealing the complex interplay of religion, politics, and artistry that defined Egyptian civilization. Beyond the physical treasures, the Valley of the Kings embodies the timeless mysteries of ancient Egypt, the precise construction techniques, the choice of tomb locations, the alignment with celestial phenomena, and the symbolic interplay of architecture, decoration, and ritual all hint at a civilization deeply attuned to both earthly and cosmic order. Even today, unexplored chambers, hidden passageways, and undeciphered inscriptions tantalize historians and archaeologists, suggesting that many secrets of the pharaoh's journeys to eternity remain buried beneath layers of rock, sand, and legend. The valley thus stands as a testament to Egypt's mastery over life, death, and memory, encapsulating the civilization's relentless quest for immortality, its reverence for divine authority, and its unparalleled ability to transform stone, art, and ritual into enduring monuments that continue to captivate, inspire, and challenge our understanding of human achievement, spirituality, and the eternal dance between the mortal and the divine.
Mummies, wrapped in layers of linen and infused with spells, oils, and amulets, reveal a civilization obsessed with preserving the essence of life and spirit, ensuring that the deceased could traverse the perilous landscapes of the afterlife, encounter divine guardians, and achieve union with the eternal. The painstaking care, scientific knowledge, and religious devotion invested in mummification speak to a culture that saw death not as an end, but as a transition, a continuation of existence that demanded both reverence and preparation. Tombs adorned with intricate frescoes, inscriptions, and magical texts map the voyage of the soul, illustrating daily life, spiritual beliefs, and the pharaoh's journey toward divine eternity, while treasures, artifacts, and offerings serve as both practical and symbolic companions in the next realm, revealing the interwoven priorities of devotion, power, and cosmic order. The legacy of ancient Egypt, however, is more than stone, gold, and linen. It is a story of human curiosity, ambition, artistry, and the relentless pursuit of immortality. A civilization that looked to the stars, measured time by the Nile, and wove its understanding of life and death into every corner of its existence. As we reflect on the pyramids, the mummies, the hidden tombs, and the countless stories encoded in hieroglyphs and monuments, we realize that ancient Egypt is not simply history, it is a living testament to what humanity can imagine, create, and preserve. A civilization whose secrets, though partially unveiled, continue to challenge, inspire, and enchant us to this very day. From the first spark of civilization along the fertile banks of the Nile to the awe-inspiring remnants that endure in the desert sun, the story of Egypt is a reminder of the beauty, mystery, and complexity of human achievement, a world where the mortal and divine intersect, where life extends beyond death,
and where every discovery carries the promise of revealing even deeper truths about existence itself. And so, as we close the sands of time over our exploration of ancient Egypt, we leave with reverence for the pharaohs, admiration for the artisans, and wonder at the mysteries that still await beneath the desert. May the echoes of history guide our dreams and inspire our curiosity, as we say, good night.
Legacy of the Pharaohs, Eternity, Mystery, and the Sands of Time. As we arrive at the final chapter of our journey through the enigmatic world of ancient Egypt, we stand before a civilization that continues to mesmerize the modern imagination with its monumental architecture, intricate rituals, and unwavering devotion to the afterlife. From the colossal pyramids of Giza, rising like timeless sentinels on the edge of the desert, to the hidden tombs of the Valley of the Kings, to the meticulously preserved mummies that whisper secrets from millennia past, every aspect of Egyptian culture reflects a civilization in constant dialogue with eternity. The pharaohs, regarded as divine intermediaries between gods and humans, wielded authority not only to govern the living, but also to secure their own immortality through architecture, art, and ritual, ensuring that their legacy would transcend centuries, surviving floods, invasions, and the relentless march of time. The pyramids themselves, engineering marvels constructed with precise alignment to celestial bodies, monumental stone blocks, and an unyielding vision of cosmic harmony, stand as enduring testaments to human ambition, ingenuity, and belief. Their interiors designed to protect the sacred remains of kings, while symbolically guiding their journey to the stars.